Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. About halfway through my drive, I rounded a sharp bend and suddenly had to slam on my brakes. There, illuminated in my headlights, was a massive dark figure standing right in the middle of the road. At first I thought it must be a bear, but as I skidded to a stop just feet away from it, I realized with growing horror that this was no ordinary animal. The creature towered over my car, easily 7 feet tall or more. It was covered in dark brown fur from head to toe, matted and shaggy. But what struck me most were its impossibly long arms that nearly reached the ground, ending in huge hands with fingers that looked more like claws. Its head was oddly pointed at the top, almost conical, and its eyes were set deep in its face, glowing an eerie yellowish color as they reflected my headlights. For a moment that felt like an eternity. We just stared at each other. I was frozen in terror, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had turned white. The creature seemed almost as startled as I was, its massive chest heaving as it breathed heavily. I could see steam coming from its mouth in the cold night air. Then, without warning, it let out a bone-chilling roar that made my blood run cold. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard before, not quite human, not quite animal, but some horrifying combination of the two. It reverberated through my entire body, and I swear I could feel the car shaking from the force of it. Panic overtook me, and I fumbled to put the car in reverse, my trembling hands barely able to grasp the gear shift. As I started to back up, the creature suddenly lunged forward with shocking speed. Its enormous hand slammed down on the hood of my car, leaving a massive dent and causing the whole vehicle to rock violently. I screamed and stomped on the gas pedal, tires squealing as I reversed as fast as I could. The creature kept pace, running alongside my car with an unnatural gait, its long arms swinging wildly. I could hear its claws scraping along the side of my car as it tried to grab hold. Somehow I managed to swing the car around and speed off in the opposite direction, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror, terrified of what I might see. I just drove as fast as I could, praying I wouldn't veer off the twisting road in my panic. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I finally reached the outskirts of town. As the first streetlights came into view, I began to feel a small measure of relief. But I didn't slow down until I pulled into my own driveway, hands shaking so badly I could barely turn off the ignition. I sat there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. Part of me wanted to believe it had all been some kind of vivid hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But the huge dent in my hood and the deep scratches along the side of my car were undeniable proof that the encounter had been all too real. When I finally worked up the courage to go inside, I immediately called the local sheriff's office to report what had happened. The deputy who answered sounded skeptical at first, but his tone changed when I described the creature in detail. He said they'd received a few other strange reports from that area over the years, though nothing quite as dramatic as my encounter. A patrol car came out to take my official statement and examine the damage to my vehicle. They took photos and samples of some dark fur that had gotten caught in one of the scratches. The deputy told me they'd increase patrols in that area, but warned me not to speak publicly about what I'd seen to avoid causing a panic. For weeks afterwards, I was jumpier than a cat. Every shadow seemed to hide some lurking monster. Every rustle in the trees sent my heart racing. I couldn't bring myself to drive down Fox Road again, taking a much longer route to and from work. My sleep was plagued by nightmares of glowing eyes and reaching claws. Gradually, the intensity of the fear began to fade, though I never forgot that terrifying encounter. I've spent years trying to make sense of what I saw that night. I've read every book and article I could find on Bigfoot and other cryptids, desperate for some explanation. But nothing quite matches the creature I encountered. The thing that haunts me most, even all these years later, is the intelligence I saw in those eyes. This wasn't just some dumb animal acting on instinct. There was something unsettlingly aware in its gaze, something that spoke of a mind far more complex than any known beast. What was it? Where did it come from? And most chillingly, where did it go? I've heard rumors over the years of other sightings in those woods, whispered stories of hikers gone missing and livestock found mutilated. But nothing concrete, nothing that could prove I wasn't just some hysterical woman imagining things on a dark night. Sometimes I wonder if I should have gone public with my story, consequences be damned. But who would have believed me? Even now, decades later, I can scarcely believe it myself. All I know for certain is that there are things in this world far stranger and more terrifying than most people realize. And on lonely stretches of road, in the dark of night, sometimes those things make themselves known in ways that shatter our understanding of reality. I still avoid driving at night when I can. And to this day, the sound of something scraping against metal is enough to send me into a cold sweat. That encounter changed me forever, leaving me with a bone-deep certainty that we are not alone in this world, and that some of the things we share it with are beyond our comprehension. So if you're ever driving down a dark country road and see something strange in your headlights, don't stop. Don't get out to investigate. Just keep driving and pray it doesn't decide to chase you. Because once you've seen what's really out there in the shadows, you can never unsee it, and you'll never feel truly safe in the dark again. Story 2. I was a young teacher back in 1970, working at the small elementary school in Easterville, Manitoba. It was a quiet little town surrounded by dense forests, and I loved the peaceful atmosphere. November had just begun, bringing a chill to the air and coating the landscape in frost each morning. That particular day started like any other. I arrived at the school early to prepare for my class, greeting our principal, Mr. Johnson, as he unlocked the front doors. We chatted briefly about the upcoming parent-teacher conferences as we walked to our respective offices. Everything felt completely normal and routine. Classes went smoothly that morning. The kids were excited about an upcoming field trip, so I spent some time going over the permission slips and itinerary with them. At lunchtime, I ate quickly in the staff room while grading some spelling tests. Again, nothing out of the ordinary. It wasn't until later that afternoon when things took a bizarre turn. School had just let out, and I was gathering my things to head home when Mr. Johnson knocked on my classroom door. He asked if I could give him and the school secretary, Mrs. Taylor, a ride into town. Apparently his car wouldn't start, and he needed to pick up some supplies for tomorrow's staff meeting. Of course I agreed. It wasn't far out of my way. We piled into my beat-up old station wagon and set off down the winding road that led from the school into Easterville proper. The sun was already starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. Mrs. Taylor and Mr. Johnson were discussing some upcoming budget issues in the front seat while I focused on navigating the curvy road. That's when I first spotted it. At first, I thought it was just a person walking along the shoulder of the road up ahead. But as we got closer, something seemed off. The figure was unnaturally tall and bulky, and the way it was moving just didn't look quite human. "Do you see that?" I asked, slowing the car slightly. Mr. Johnson and Mrs. Taylor stopped their conversation and peered out the windshield. "What in the world?" Mr. Johnson muttered. As we approached, I could make out more details, and my heart started racing. This was definitely not a person. The creature, and I use that word purposefully, was massive. It had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall, and it was covered in dark, matted fur from head to toe. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel as we drew closer. The thing turned its head to look at us, and I let out an involuntary gasp. Its face was unlike anything I'd ever seen, a bizarre mix of ape-like and human features, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow in the fading daylight. "Oh my God," Mrs. Taylor whispered. "What is that?" I was too stunned to respond. My foot eased off the gas pedal without me even realizing it, and we slowed to a crawl. The creature turned to fully face our approaching vehicle. That's when I noticed its incredibly long arms hanging down almost to its knees, and its neck, or rather, lack thereof. The head seemed to sit directly on its broad, sloping shoulders. Mr. Johnson leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. It almost looks like some kind of ape, but that's impossible out here. As we inched closer, the creature suddenly reared up to its full height. It had to be close to 8 feet tall. A primal sort of terror gripped me, every instinct screaming to flee. Without thinking, I slammed on the brakes. For a long moment, we all just stared in shocked silence. The creature stared right back, its eyes seeming to bore into us. I felt frozen, unable to look away or even blink. Then, with surprising speed and grace for something so large, it turned and loped into the forest beside the road. Within seconds, it had vanished into the lengthening shadows beneath the trees. We sat there for what felt like an eternity, all of us struggling to process what we'd just witnessed. Finally, Mr. Johnson broke the silence. We need to go back and get a better look, to make sure we really saw what we think we saw. Part of me wanted nothing more than to floor it and get as far away as possible. But I knew he was right. We had to know for sure. With trembling hands, I put the car in reverse and slowly backed up to where we'd first spotted the creature. We all got out, peering into the deepening gloom of the forest. "Hello?" Mr. Johnson called out tentatively. "Is anyone there?" Silence. Just the whisper of wind through the trees and the pounding of my own heart. We stood there for several long minutes, straining our eyes and ears for any sign of the creature. But there was nothing. It was as if it had never been there at all. Finally, Mrs. Taylor spoke up. Maybe we should notify the police, or a park ranger." Mr. Johnson nodded slowly. "Yes, I think that would be wise, though I'm not sure what exactly we'd tell them we saw." We got back in the car and I drove us to the small police station in town. The whole way there we kept glancing nervously out the windows, half expecting to see the creature again. But the roads remained empty. At the station, we must have sounded like lunatics trying to explain what we'd witnessed. The officer on duty listened patiently, but I could tell he didn't really believe us. He took down our information and said he'd send a patrol car out to check the area, but I knew nothing would come of it. Over the next few days, we all struggled to come to terms with what we'd seen. We agreed to keep it quiet to avoid alarming the children or becoming the subject of ridicule in our small town. But privately, we couldn't stop talking about it amongst ourselves. Mr. Johnson pored over books about North American wildlife, trying to find any known animal that could match what we saw. Mrs. Taylor scoured newspaper archives for any similar sightings in the area, and I found myself lying awake at night, replaying the encounter over and over in my mind. The image of that creature was seared into my memory. Its towering height, the matted dark fur, those unsettlingly intelligent eyes. I kept wondering, what was it? Where did it come from? And why hadn't anyone else ever reported seeing something like this before? As the days turned to weeks and then months, we gradually spoke of it less and less. Life went on, and the encounter faded into a sort of surreal memory. But I never forgot. To this day, over 50 years later, I can still picture that creature with perfect clarity. I've read about Bigfoot sightings over the years, seen grainy photos and shaky video footage. But nothing I've come across has ever quite matched what we saw that day. Whatever it was something other. Something that shouldn't exist in our rational modern world. I'm an old woman now, retired from teaching long ago, but I still live in Easterville. Sometimes on quiet evenings, I find myself driving down that same stretch of road, and every time I slow down and peer into the trees, half expecting to catch another glimpse of that impossible creature. I never have, of course. But I know what I saw that day. Mr. Johnson and Mrs. Taylor are both gone now, but I know they went to their graves just as certain as I am. Something was out there in those woods, something unexplainable, and who knows, maybe it's still out there watching and waiting. I suppose I'll never know for sure. But that one brief encounter changed how I see the world forever. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things beyond our understanding, creatures that defy explanation. And on dark nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I still find myself wondering, what else might be hiding out there in the shadows, just beyond the reach of our perception? It's a chilling thought, but also, in a strange way, oddly comforting. To know that even in this age of science and technology, there are still mysteries in the world, still wonders waiting to be discovered, or perhaps rediscovered. Because sometimes I can't help but think, what if that creature wasn't something new, but something ancient, something that's always been there, lurking on the fringes of our world, a relic from a time before humans ruled the earth, surviving against all odds in the most remote wilderness. I'll likely never know the truth. But that fleeting encounter on a dusky November evening all those years ago left me with a sense of awe and wonder that's never faded, and a certainty that there are still secrets out there, waiting to be uncovered by those brave or fortunate enough to glimpse them. So if you're ever driving down a lonely road as twilight falls, keep your eyes open. You never know what you might see in those shadowy spaces between the known and unknown. Just be prepared. Once you've seen it, you can never unsee it, and it might just change your entire view of reality. Story 3. We arrived at the lake on a Friday afternoon and set up our campsite near the shore. The weather was perfect, warm and sunny with a light breeze. We spent that first evening just taking it easy, grilling up some burgers and knocking back a few beers as we watched the sunset over the water. It was exactly the kind of peaceful getaway we'd been hoping for. The next morning, we woke up early, eager to get out on the lake and try our luck fishing. We loaded up our small aluminum boat with our gear and pushed off from shore just as the sun was starting to peek over the trees. The lake was like glass, with wisps of mist still clinging to the surface in places. We motored out to a quiet cove that looked promising and cut the engine, letting the boat drift as we baited our hooks and cast our lines. For the next couple hours, we had pretty good luck. We caught a few decent-sized trout and were having a great time just being out on the water. Around mid-morning, we decided to try our luck in a different spot. As we were slowly motoring along the shoreline looking for a good place to stop, Tom suddenly grabbed my arm and pointed toward the far side of a small inlet we were passing. "Holy shit, do you see that?" he said in a hushed voice. I looked where he was pointing and felt my jaw drop. There, maybe 100 yards away, was what looked like a massive, hairy creature swimming across the inlet. At first I thought it must be a bear, but as I watched, I realized it was moving in a way that seemed different, more human-like somehow. We cut the engine and just sat there, speechless, as this thing continued to swim across the inlet. It was using some kind of smooth, gliding motion to move through the water. The weirdest part was that we couldn't see its arms at all. It was like they were tucked in close to its body as it swam. As it got closer to the opposite shore, I fumbled for the small pair of binoculars we had brought. By the time I got them focused, the creature was already climbing out of the water onto the bank. What I saw through those binoculars is seared into my memory. It was huge, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. It shook itself vigorously as it emerged from the water, and that's when I saw its arms for the first time. They were incredibly long, hanging down almost to its knees. Tom and I just sat there, frozen, as this thing took a few lumbering steps up the bank. Then, with shocking speed for something so large, it turned and disappeared into the tall grass and underbrush. We looked at each other, eyes wide, neither of us saying a word for what felt like several minutes. Finally, Tom broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" he said, his voice shaky. I shook my head, still trying to process what I'd just seen. I don't know, but it sure as hell wasn't a bear. We spent the next hour debating what to do. Part of me wanted to go investigate the spot where the creature had emerged from the water, but a bigger part of me was frankly terrified at the idea of potentially encountering that thing on land. In the end, we decided to head back to our campsite. We were both pretty rattled, and neither of us felt much like fishing anymore. As we motored back across the lake, I kept scanning the shoreline, half expecting to see that creature again. But there was no sign of it. Back at camp, we cracked open a couple beers and tried to calm our nerves. We went back and forth, questioning what we'd seen, trying to come up with some kind of rational explanation. But deep down, we both knew. "It had to be a Sasquatch, right?" Tom finally said. "I mean, what else could it have been?" I nodded slowly. Yeah, I think it was." We spent the rest of that day and night on edge, jumping at every little sound from the surrounding forest. Needless to say, we didn't do any more fishing. The next morning, we packed up camp and headed home a day early. On the drive back, we swore each other to secrecy. We were both afraid of being labeled as crazy if we told anyone what we'd seen. And honestly, part of me hoped that if I just didn't talk about it, maybe I could convince myself it hadn't really happened. But here I am, over 50 years later, and I can still see that creature clear as day in my mind. The way it moved through the water, the shocking size of it as it emerged onto the bank, those impossibly long arms. I've read other Sasquatch encounter stories over the years, but I've never come across another one quite like ours. I don't know why it was swimming across that inlet that day. I don't know where it came from or where it went, but I know what I saw, and while part of me wishes I could forget it, another part of me is glad I had the experience. It opened my eyes to the fact that there are still mysteries out there in the world, things that defy easy explanation. To this day, whenever I'm out in nature, especially near water, I find myself scanning the shorelines and tree lines. I've never seen anything like that creature again, but I know it's out there somewhere. And who knows, maybe someday someone else will be lucky, or unlucky, enough to have their own encounter with the swimming Sasquatch of Priest Lake. Story 4. On this particular evening in late July, I decided to take my usual route down by Beaver Creek. The air was thick and humid, but there was a slight breeze that made it bearable. As I walked along the well-worn path, I could hear the buzzing of mosquitoes and the occasional splash of fish jumping in the creek. Everything seemed normal at first. I had been walking for about 30 minutes when I started to get an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt like I was being watched. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But the feeling wouldn't go away. That's when I heard it. A loud cracking sound coming from near the old beaver lodge about 50 yards ahead of me. It sounded like a large branch snapping, but there was no wind. My heart started racing as I stood frozen in place, straining my ears to listen. For a few moments, there was only silence. Then I heard another crack, followed by the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. Whatever it was big. My hands shaking, I fumbled in my pocket for the small flashlight I always carried on my walks. I knew I should probably turn and run, but curiosity got the better of me. I had to see what was making those sounds. I clicked on the flashlight and slowly panned the beam toward the beaver lodge. At first, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, just the old wooden structure surrounded by tall grass and reeds. But then something moved. My blood ran cold as I saw a massive dark shape suddenly rise up from behind the beaver lodge. It must have been crouching down before, because when it stood to its full height, it was enormous, easily 7 feet tall, probably more. The beam of my flashlight illuminated a creature unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was covered in dark, matted fur and had long, powerful arms that nearly reached the ground. Its head was oddly shaped, almost cone-like, sitting directly on broad shoulders with no discernible neck. But it was the eyes that filled me with terror, gleaming red orbs that reflected my flashlight beam like those of a wild animal. They were fixed directly on me. For a split second we just stared at each other. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even breathe. Then the creature let out a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through my entire body. That sound snapped me out of my trance. Panic overtook me, and I turned and ran faster than I ever had in my life. I could hear heavy footsteps and branches snapping behind me as I sprinted down the path, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of town, nearly 2 miles away. By then, my lungs were burning, and my legs felt like jelly. I bent over, hands on my knees, gasping for air as I looked back over my shoulder. There was no sign of the creature following me. Once I caught my breath, I hurried home and locked all the doors and windows. I was shaking so badly I could barely hold my coffee mug as I tried to calm my nerves. I didn't sleep at all that night, jumping at every little sound outside. The next day, I went to the local police station to report what I had seen. The officer listened patiently, but I could tell he didn't believe me. He suggested maybe it was just a bear, but I knew what I saw wasn't any normal animal. Over the next few weeks, I heard rumors of other strange sightings in the area. A couple camping near Beaver Creek claimed they heard terrifying howls in the night. A farmer on the outskirts of town said something had been killing his livestock. But as suddenly as it all started, the sightings and incidents stopped. By the end of August, things seemed to go back to normal in Reynolds. Some folks said it was just mass hysteria or that someone was playing an elaborate prank on the town. I know what I saw that night was real, though. To this day, I can still picture those glowing red eyes staring at me from the darkness. I never went walking alone at night again after that, and I still get chills every time I drive past Beaver Creek. I don't know what that creature was or where it came from. Maybe it was some kind of undiscovered species, or something not of this world. All I know is that it was the most terrifying experience of my life, and it changed me forever. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there somewhere, lurking in the forests of Manitoba. I hope I never find out. But I'll never forget that summer night in 1970 when I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist. Story 5. I was a sophomore at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff back then. My buddy Tom and I had driven out to a secluded spot off Old Munns Highway, about 20 minutes south of town. It was a popular makeout spot for college kids, far enough from campus to feel private, but not so remote that you'd get totally lost trying to find it. We weren't there for any romantic reasons, though. Tom had just gone through a bad breakup and needed to get away from his dorm for a while. I offered to drive him out there so we could just talk and clear our heads. Maybe smoke a joint, if I'm being totally honest. It was around 1 a.m., and we'd been sitting in my beat-up Chevy Nova for about an hour, shooting the breeze and listening to the radio. The night was crystal clear, and you could see every star in the sky. It was peaceful, but there was also this eerie stillness that I can't quite explain, like the forest was holding its breath. I remember Tom was in the middle of telling some long-winded story about his ex when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence. His eyes went wide, and he just froze, staring out the passenger window. I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw it. There was this creature peering in at us from just outside the car. At first I thought it was a bear, but as my eyes adjusted I realized it was something else entirely. It was hunched over slightly, its face pressed close to the glass. The thing was covered in shaggy dark fur from head to toe, but its face, God, its face. It was almost flat, with deep-set eyes that reflected the dim glow from my dashboard. They looked disturbingly intelligent. I'd guess it was around 5 feet tall, though it was hard to tell exactly with how it was stooped over. It had broad shoulders and long arms that hung down past its knees. The proportions were all wrong for it to be human, but it wasn't quite animal either. For what felt like an eternity, we all just stayed frozen like that. Tom and I staring in shock, this creature staring right back at us with an almost curious expression. I could hear Tom's ragged breathing and smell the acrid stench of fear sweat. My own heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Then Tom let out this strangled yelp and the spell was broken. The creature's head snapped back, startled by the sudden noise. It took a slow step away from the car, still watching us intently. I fumbled for my keys with shaking hands, ready to gun it out of there, but the thing didn't attack or run away. It just ambled off into the darkness between the trees, almost casually, like it was just out for a stroll and had gotten momentarily distracted by us. The nonchalance of it was somehow even more terrifying than if it had been aggressive. As soon as it disappeared from view, I cranked the engine and peeled out of there so fast I'm surprised I didn't blow a tire. Tom and I didn't say a word the entire drive back to campus. What was there to say? We both knew what we'd seen, but it didn't make any sense. When we got back to the dorms, Tom insisted we go to the campus police right away. I was reluctant. I mean, who the hell would believe us? But he was adamant, said we had a responsibility to report it in case it was dangerous. So at 2:30 in the morning, we found ourselves sitting across from a very skeptical campus cop, trying to describe what we'd encountered. I could tell from his face that he thought we were either drunk, high, or pulling some kind of prank. But he dutifully took down our statements and said he'd pass the information along to the regular Flagstaff PD. Word spread quickly around campus over the next few days. Most people laughed it off or assumed we were attention-seeking. A few Bigfoot enthusiasts got really excited and wanted to organize search parties, but Tom and I just wanted to forget the whole thing. I tried to rationalize it at first. Maybe it was just a bear standing on its hind legs, or some weirdo in a costume playing a sick joke. But deep down, I knew neither of those explanations fit. What we saw that night was something other, something that shouldn't exist in our world. For weeks afterwards, I had trouble sleeping. Every noise outside my window made me jump. I kept replaying that moment over and over, analyzing every detail. The intelligence in those eyes, the way it moved, the sheer wrongness of its entire being. Tom and I drifted apart after that night. I think we both just wanted to pretend it never happened. Last I heard, he'd moved back east and become an accountant or something. We never really talked about it again. I've only told a handful of people about this over the years. Most react with polite skepticism at best. My wife believed me, God bless her, but I could tell it unsettled her, so I don't bring it up anymore. But I know what I saw, and in all the years since, I've never been able to fully shake the feeling that we glimpsed something that night that wasn't meant for human eyes. Some boundary between our world and another that had momentarily thinned. I still avoid camping or spending time in the woods if I can help it. And to this day, I can't look at the stars without remembering that crystal-clear January night and the creature that emerged from the darkness to peer in at us with those two knowing eyes. I don't know if it was a Bigfoot or something else entirely. I don't know if there are more of them out there, but I do know that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk just beyond the edge of firelight, watching and waiting. And sometimes, if we're very unlucky, those things decide to take a closer look at us. Story 6. I'll never forget that January in Duchess County. It was 1971, and I was just a 19-year-old kid working odd jobs to make ends meet. The winters up there can be brutal, and that year was particularly nasty. We'd had record snowfall, and I was spending most of my days shoveling driveways and clearing roads just to keep busy. It was during one of those marathon shoveling sessions that I first saw it. I was clearing the long driveway of old Mrs. Henderson's place out near the woods. It was late afternoon, the light already fading as I worked my way down towards the road. I remember pausing to catch my breath, leaning on my shovel and looking out towards the tree line. That's when I noticed something moving between the pines. At first, I thought it was just shadows playing tricks on my tired eyes. But then I saw it step out into a clearing, this massive, fur-covered figure walking on two legs. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, with long arms that hung down past its knees. For a second I wondered if it was just some guy in a costume, but the way it moved, it was too fluid, too natural. No costume could mimic that gait. I stood there frozen, not daring to move a muscle. It hadn't seemed to notice me yet, and I wanted to keep it that way. But then it turned its head in my direction, and I swear I felt those eyes boring into me from 50 yards away. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. We just stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a few seconds. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and loped back into the woods, disappearing among the trees. I don't know how long I stood there after it was gone, my legs shaking so bad I could barely stand. When I finally snapped out of it, I practically ran to my truck and got the hell out of there. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. Who would believe me? I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination running wild, maybe some big bear walking funny. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. A couple weeks went by, and I'd almost managed to put the whole thing out of my mind. Then came the second encounter. It was a Friday night, and I was out with my buddy Mike. We'd driven up to this spot that was popular with the local couples, you know, for parking and making out and whatnot. We weren't there for that, though, just to drink a few beers away from prying eyes. We were sitting on the hood of my truck, shooting the shit and looking up at the stars. It was a clear night, bitterly cold, but beautiful. That's when we heard it, this low, rumbling growl coming from the woods nearby. Mike laughed it off, said it was probably just some dog, but I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I knew that sound wasn't coming from any dog. I was about to suggest we leave when we saw movement at the edge of the woods. And there it was again, that massive, furry shape emerging from the shadows. Mike saw it too this time. I heard him mutter, "What the fuck?" under his breath. It was closer this time, maybe 30 yards away. Close enough that I could make out more details. The broad, sloping forehead, the deep-set eyes glinting in the moonlight. It was sniffing the air, head swiveling back and forth as if searching for something. Mike and I were both frozen in place, too scared to even breathe. Then it locked eyes with us, and I swear I saw recognition there, like it remembered me from before. It took a step in our direction, and that was enough to break the spell. We scrambled off the hood and dove into the cab of my truck. I cranked the engine and peeled out of there so fast, I'm surprised I didn't wrap us around a tree. Mike was in hysterics the whole way back to town, alternating between nervous laughter and, "Did you see that? Tell me you fucking saw that." I just gripped the steering wheel and tried to keep us on the road, my mind racing. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that this thing, whatever it was out there. And for some reason, our paths kept crossing. I found myself obsessing over it, spending hours researching Bigfoot sightings and local legends. I even managed to convince Mike and our friend Tom to go looking for it with me. We headed out to the woods near where I'd had my first encounter, armed with flashlights and a healthy dose of liquid courage. In retrospect, it was incredibly stupid. We had no idea what we were dealing with, and we were basically serving ourselves up on a silver platter. We'd been tromping around in the woods for maybe an hour, calling out and making all kinds of racket. I was starting to think this whole expedition was a waste of time when we heard a branch snap nearby. We all froze, shining our lights in the direction of the sound. And there it was, standing maybe 15 feet away. It was even bigger up close, easily 8 or 9 feet tall. Its fur was a mottled brown, matted in places. But what I remember most vividly were its eyes, deep-set and intelligent, with an almost reddish glow in the beam of our flashlights. It was holding something, a long branch or stick, gripped in one massive hand like a club. For a moment, we all just stared at each other in shocked silence. Then Tom let out this high-pitched scream and bolted. Mike and I were right on his heels. We ran blindly through the woods, branches whipping at our faces. I could hear heavy footsteps behind us, gaining ground with each stride. We burst out of the tree line near where we'd parked, scrambling towards Mike's pickup. I risked a glance back and saw it emerge from the woods, that makeshift club raised above its head. It let out this bone-chilling roar that I still hear in my nightmares sometimes. We piled into the truck cab, and Mike floored it before we even had the doors closed. As we tore down the dirt road, I looked in the side mirror and saw it standing there at the edge of the woods, watching us go. The image is seared into my brain, this massive primeval figure silhouetted against the night sky, holding that club like some kind of ancient warrior. We didn't stop driving until we hit the town limits. None of us said a word the whole way back. What was there to say? We'd seen something that shouldn't exist, something that flew in the face of everything we thought we knew about the world. In the days that followed, we heard other stories from around the county. Farmers finding their fences damaged, with sections of barbed wire torn out like tissue paper. Hikers and hunters catching glimpses of a giant, fur-covered figure moving through the trees. It seemed like our encounter had opened the floodgates, and suddenly everyone had a story to tell. But just as quickly as it had started, it all stopped. The sightings dried up, the stories faded away. It was like whatever had been out there in those woods just vanished into thin air. It's been over 50 years now, and I still don't know what to make of what happened that winter. Was it really Bigfoot, some unknown species, or just mass hysteria fueled by too many long, cold nights? I don't have any answers. All I know is what I saw, what I experienced. And no matter how much time passes, I'll never forget those encounters in Duchess County. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is blowing just right, I swear I can still hear that roar echoing through the trees. And I wonder if it's still out there somewhere, watching and waiting in the darkness of the forest. Story 7. Our team of 6 had set up camp right on the edge of the mound. It was a balmy night. Typical Florida weather even in winter. The sound of waves lapping at the shore and the chirping of insects filled the air as we settled into our tents after a long day of excavation work. I must have dozed off at some point, but I was jolted awake around 3 a.m. by the sound of heavy footsteps. At first, I thought I was dreaming. The footfalls were so loud and powerful, like nothing I'd ever heard before. But as I became more alert, I realized this was very real. My heart started racing as I listened intently. The footsteps seemed to be circling our campsite, getting closer and then further away again. I could hear twigs snapping and leaves rustling with each thunderous step. Whatever was out there was massive. I was paralyzed with fear, not daring to move or make a sound. Part of me wanted to peek outside, but another part was terrified of what I might see. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two, I heard someone whisper from the tent next to mine. "Hey, you awake? You hearing this?" It was Dr. Osborne, our team lead. "Yeah," I whispered back. "What the hell is it?" "I don't know, but I'm going to look," he replied. I heard the zipper of his tent slowly opening. Mustering my courage, I decided to do the same. With trembling hands, I unzipped my tent just enough to peer out. What I saw next is burned into my memory forever. There, not 20 feet from our campsite, was a massive figure. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, covered in light brown hair or fur. The moonlight silhouetted its hulking form against the tree line. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could make out more details. It had a distinctly ape-like shape, with long arms that hung below its knees, but it was standing fully upright on 2 legs, like a human. Its head seemed small in proportion to its body, with a pronounced brow ridge. The creature was facing away from us, its head swiveling slowly as if scanning the area. Then, without warning, it turned and looked directly at our tents. I caught a glimpse of glowing eyes reflecting the moonlight before I quickly ducked back inside, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. That's when the smell hit me, an overwhelming stench of wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation. It was so powerful I had to fight the urge to gag. I heard more movement outside as the other team members stirred. There were hushed whispers of shock and disbelief. Nobody dared speak above a whisper or make any sudden movements. For what felt like hours, but was probably only 10-15 minutes, we all sat frozen in our tents. The heavy footsteps continued to circle the camp, sometimes coming frighteningly close. At one point, I swear I could hear deep, guttural breathing right outside my tent. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature seemed to move off into the forest. The footsteps grew fainter until we could no longer hear them. An eerie silence fell over the camp. None of us slept for the rest of the night. We huddled in our tents, too terrified to venture outside until the first light of dawn began to appear. As soon as it was light enough, we cautiously emerged from our tents. The campsite was undisturbed, but the ground around it told a different story. There were huge, unmistakable footprints in the soft soil, 5 of them in total. Dr. Osborne immediately set about measuring and documenting them. They were a staggering 17 inches long and 11 inches wide. The impression was so deep, it was clear whatever made them was incredibly heavy. We quickly mixed up some plaster and made casts of the prints before they could be disturbed. As we worked, the reality of what we had experienced began to sink in. There was no denying it. We had encountered something that shouldn't exist. The rest of the day was a blur. We were all in a state of shock, trying to process what had happened. Our planned excavation work was forgotten as we debated what to do next. Dr. Osborne was adamant that we needed to report our findings and continue investigating. Others on the team wanted to pack up and leave immediately, too shaken to stay another night. In the end, we compromised. We agreed to stay one more night, but we'd move our camp to the beach, where we'd have a clear view of our surroundings. We also set up a rotation, so someone would be on watch at all times. That second night was tense, but uneventful. Whatever had visited us didn't return. In the morning, we packed up our gear and the plaster casts and headed back to the mainland. The weeks that followed were frustrating. We reported our experience to local authorities and wildlife officials, but were met with skepticism and even ridicule. The plaster casts were dismissed as likely hoaxes, despite our academic credentials and reputation. Dr. Osborne tried to organize a follow-up expedition, but couldn't secure funding or support. It seemed like the scientific community wanted to pretend our encounter had never happened. Over time, most of the team stopped talking about that night. It was easier to try and forget than to face the disbelief and mockery. But I've never been able to shake the memory of what I saw and heard. To this day, I'm not sure what to make of our experience. I know what I saw wasn't a bear or any other known animal. The footprints we found were undeniably real. But the idea of an 8-foot-tall, bipedal ape-like creature living undetected in Florida seems impossible. And yet, I can't deny the evidence of my own eyes and ears. That night changed my understanding of the world and what might be possible. I often find myself wondering, if such a creature could exist without being officially discovered, what other mysteries might be out there just waiting to be uncovered? I don't expect anyone to believe my story. Hell, there are days I have trouble believing it myself. But I know what I experienced, and I felt compelled to share it here. Maybe someday someone else will have a similar encounter, and my account will help them make sense of it. Until then, I'll keep searching for answers, hoping that one day the truth about what we saw that night in 1971 will finally come to light. Story 8. The night was pitch black, with only my headlights illuminating the winding forest road ahead. Margie and I were chatting and laughing, the radio playing softly in the background. We were about 20 miles outside of town when I noticed something odd up ahead. At first I thought it was just shadows from the trees, but as we got closer, I realized there was a massive dark shape looming by the side of the road. I slowed the car, squinting to try and make out what it was. "Chuck, what is that?" Margie asked, her voice suddenly tense. Before I could answer, the shape moved. In an instant, I realized we were looking at some kind of enormous creature, easily 7 feet tall and covered in dark, shaggy hair. My blood ran cold as I saw 2 gleaming eyes reflect in my headlights. The creature's head turned towards us, and I hit the brakes hard, the tires screeching on the pavement. Margie let out a frightened gasp as the thing took a step towards our car. I fumbled to put the car in reverse, my hands shaking. But before I could, the creature closed the distance in 2 giant strides. It was right next to my driver's side window now, and I could see matted fur, massive shoulders, long arms ending in huge hands. The stench was overwhelming, like wet dog and rotting vegetation. Margie was frozen in terror beside me. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, could barely breathe as I stared up at this impossible thing looming over us. For a split second, our eyes met. I saw intelligence there, something almost human mixed with raw animal ferocity. Then its lips pulled back in a snarl, revealing yellowed fangs. That's when it slammed its hands down on the roof of the car with tremendous force. The whole vehicle shook violently, and Margie screamed. I remember hearing the crunch of metal giving way under the impact. Panic exploded through me, and I finally managed to slam the car into drive. I floored the gas pedal, the engine roaring as we shot forward. In the rearview mirror, I caught a final glimpse of the creature as it let out a bone-chilling howl that echoed through the forest. Then we were speeding down the road, my knuckles white on the steering wheel as Margie sobbed beside me. We didn't stop driving until we reached the next town, about 30 miles away. My hands were still shaking as I pulled into a gas station. We sat there in silence for a long time, both of us too shocked to speak. Finally, Margie turned to me with wide, terrified eyes. "Chuck, what the hell was that thing?" I shook my head, at a loss for words. We got out to inspect the damage to the car roof. There were 2 massive dents where its hands had struck. The metal crumpled like tin foil. Margie ran her fingers over the warped metal, her face pale. "This is impossible," she whispered. We debated whether to report it to the police, but who would believe us? We'd sound crazy. So we drove home in tense silence, both jumping at every shadow on the road. For weeks afterward, I had vivid nightmares about those glowing eyes and yellowed fangs. Margie and I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a bear, we told ourselves. But we both knew that was a lie. What we'd seen that night was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist. I've spent years trying to forget that night, to convince myself it didn't really happen. But the memory of that creature's eyes meeting mine, the raw power I felt as it shook our car, the primal fear that gripped me, it's all seared into my mind forever. Sometimes when I'm driving on a dark, lonely road, I find myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that hulking shape emerge from the shadows. The fear comes rushing back, as fresh as it was that night in 1971. I don't know what we encountered out there in the forests of Washington. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, some unknown species. I can't say for sure. All I know is that it was terrifyingly real, and it changed me forever. There are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that lurk just beyond the edge of what we understand. And sometimes, if you're unlucky, you might just catch a glimpse of them. I've never told this story publicly before. For years, Margie and I barely spoke about it, even to each other. We eventually drifted apart, the memory of that night always lingering between us like an unspoken secret. But as I've gotten older, I've felt a growing need to share what happened, to get it out in the open. I know most people won't believe me. Hell, there are days I can barely believe it myself. But I know what I saw, what I felt, what I smelled that night. It was real as anything I've ever experienced. And somewhere out there, in the deep forests of the Pacific Northwest, that creature is still out there, waiting, watching. To this day, I can't drive through heavily forested areas without breaking into a cold sweat. The sound of branches snapping in the woods makes my heart race. And on quiet nights, when the wind is just right, I sometimes think I hear a distant, inhuman howl echoing from the mountains. And I wonder, is it out there, remembering our encounter just as vividly as I do? I don't expect anyone to believe this story, but I needed to tell it, to finally let it out after all these years. If nothing else, maybe it will serve as a warning to others. Be careful out there in the wilderness. Keep your eyes open and your wits about you, because you never know what might be lurking just beyond the reach of your headlights, waiting to remind you that there are still mysteries in this world that we can't explain. Story 9. It was close to midnight and I was getting ready for bed. My wife had already turned in, and I was just doing a final check of the house before joining her. As I walked past the living room window, something caught my eye outside. At first I thought it was just shadows from the trees moving in the breeze. But then I saw it clearly, a massive, hairy figure peering in at me. My blood ran cold. This thing was huge, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur. And its eyes, God, those glowing red eyes boring into me. I yelled for my wife to call the police as I ran to grab my shotgun. By the time I got back to the window, the creature had disappeared into the woods behind our property. A couple of my buddies who lived nearby heard the commotion and came running over. We decided to try and track this thing, see if we could figure out what the hell it was. Looking back, that was pretty damn stupid of us. But we were younger then, and full of that false bravado that comes from being in a group. We headed into the woods with our guns and flashlights. The whole time, the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. It felt like we were being watched from the shadows. We found some strange tracks, huge footprints, way bigger than a man's. They led deeper into the forest, but we lost the trail after a while. After about an hour of fruitless searching, we decided to head back to the house. That's when things went from bad to worse. As we approached my back door, we heard this terrible howling sound. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, not quite animal, not quite human. It chilled me to my core. Suddenly, the back door exploded inward with a massive crash. Wood splinters flew everywhere, and there it was, the creature hunched in the doorway, In the light from the kitchen, I could see it clearly now. It was like a massive ape, but walking upright like a man. Thick, matted fur covered its entire body. The face was almost human-like, but twisted into a terrifying snarl. Everything happened so fast after that. My friends started firing their guns, but the bullets didn't seem to even slow it down. It lunged forward and swatted me aside like I was nothing. I went flying across the room and slammed into the wall. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and I crumpled to the floor. Through blurry vision, I saw the creature tear through the kitchen, knocking over the table and chairs. My friends were yelling and still shooting, but their voices sounded far away. The last thing I remember before blacking out was those glowing red eyes fixed on me one last time. I woke up in the hospital the next day. Apparently my wife had called an ambulance when she heard all the chaos. The doctors said I had a concussion and some bruised ribs, but was lucky it wasn't worse. When I told them what happened, they exchanged worried looks. I could tell they didn't believe me. The local sheriff came by to take my statement. He listened patiently, but I could see the doubt in his eyes too. Said they'd look into it, but I knew they thought I was crazy or drunk or both. To be fair, if someone had told me this story a few days earlier, I wouldn't have believed them either. But I knew what I saw, and the evidence was there. The destroyed back door, the overturned furniture, the strange tracks in the woods. A few other locals even came forward saying they'd seen glimpses of a large hare creature in the area recently. The incident made the local papers. Some folks were sympathetic, but I could feel the sideways glances and whispers when I went into town. "There goes Bobby Ford, the guy who got beat up by Bigfoot," they'd say. It was humiliating. I tried to go back to normal life, but I just couldn't. Every noise in the night made me jump. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, reliving that moment when the creature burst through the door. My wife was supportive, but I could tell she was scared too. After a few weeks, I just couldn't take it anymore. We decided to move, packed up everything, and left Folk in the rearview mirror. Found a place a few hundred miles away where nobody knew us or our story. It's been years now, but I still think about that night all the time. Was it really Bigfoot, some kind of escaped ape? Or am I just crazy like some people think? I don't have any answers. All I know is what I saw and experienced, and I know I never want to go through anything like that again. I still get nightmares sometimes. In them, I'm back in that kitchen, staring into those red eyes as the creature towers over me. I wake up in a panic, drenched in sweat. My wife holds me and tells me it's okay, it was just a dream. But we both know it wasn't always just a dream. I've tried to move on with my life as best I can. Got a new job, made new friends. But I'm not the same person I was before that night. I'm always looking over my shoulder, always a little on edge. I don't go camping anymore, or even for walks in the woods. The thought of being out there in the dark, vulnerable, it's too much. I've read about other Bigfoot sightings over the years. Some sound similar to what I experienced. It gives me a strange sense of validation, knowing I'm not alone. But it also brings back all those feelings of fear and helplessness. I don't talk about it much anymore. Most people don't believe me anyway. But sometimes when I'm alone with my thoughts, I find myself replaying that night over and over. The sound of the door smashing in, the inhuman strength as it tossed me across the room. Those eyes. I don't know if I'll ever truly understand what happened that night in Folk. Was it really a Bigfoot? Some other kind of creature? Or just a twisted figment of my imagination? I guess I'll never know for sure. But one thing I do know, it changed me forever. And no matter how much time passes, a part of me will always be that terrified 25-year-old, staring into the face of something I never thought could exist. So that's my story. Believe it or don't, I've gotten used to both reactions over the years. But I know what I saw. And I know that somewhere out there, in the deep, dark woods, there are things that defy explanation, things that most people will go their whole lives without encountering, and sometimes I think I might be the lucky one for that. Story 10. As I rounded a bend, my headlights suddenly illuminated something on the road ahead. At first I thought it was a deer, but as I got closer I realized it was far too large. My heart started racing as I slammed on the brakes. The tires screeched against the pavement as I skidded to a stop about 50 feet from the figure. What I saw next will haunt me for the rest of my days. Standing in the middle of the road was a massive, hulking creature covered in dark, matted fur. It was hunched over, with long arms that hung down past its knees. The thing had to be at least 7 feet tall, even in its crouched posture. Its head swiveled towards my car, and I caught a glimpse of glowing yellow eyes reflecting in my headlights. I sat there paralyzed, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. For a moment, the creature and I just stared at each other. Then it let out a guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. In an instant, it turned and bounded across the road on 2 legs. But the way it moved was all wrong, jerky and unnatural, like some kind of bizarrely oversized ape. It cleared the entire width of the highway in just a few strides, disappearing into the dense forest on the other side. As soon as it vanished from view, I snapped out of my daze and fumbled to roll up my windows and lock the doors. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely manage it. I sat there for several minutes, heart pounding in my chest, afraid to move. Part of me wondered if I had imagined the whole thing. But I knew deep down that what I'd seen was real. Eventually, I worked up the courage to continue driving. I white-knuckled the steering wheel the entire way home, constantly checking my mirrors and scanning the sides of the road. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I ran inside and locked all the doors and windows. I didn't sleep a wink that night. The next morning, I convinced myself it must have been a bear or some other large animal that my tired mind had misinterpreted. But later that day, I overheard some other locals at the diner talking about a strange creature they'd spotted on Highway 71 the night before. My blood ran cold as I listened to them describe the exact same thing I had seen. Over the next few weeks, there were more sightings reported around town. People were calling it the Folk Monster, after the nearby town of Folk. Some claimed it was just a hoax. Others thought it might be an escaped zoo animal. But I knew the truth. There was something unnatural lurking in our forests. I became obsessed with researching similar creature sightings and trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I pored over books about cryptozoology and unexplained phenomena. The more I read, the more convinced I became that I had encountered something beyond normal scientific explanation. For months afterwards, I avoided driving on Highway 71 at night. When I did have to make the trip after dark, my nerves were on high alert the entire time. I kept waiting for that hulking shape to appear in my headlights again. But as time passed and the sightings died down, I started to relax a bit. Still, I've never been able to fully shake the memory of that night. The image of those glowing eyes and that unnatural gait are seared into my mind. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, the creature's growl echoing in my ears. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. To this day, I'm not sure what exactly I encountered on that lonely stretch of highway. Was it some undiscovered species, an escaped experiment, something supernatural? I may never know for certain, but one thing's for sure. I'll never forget the night I came face to face with the Folk Monster. I've shared my story with a few close friends over the years, but most people just think I'm crazy or making it up, so I've mostly kept it to myself. But recently I've been reading about other encounters people have had with similar creatures all across the country. It makes me wonder just how many others have seen what I saw, but have been too afraid to come forward. Sometimes I find myself driving down that same stretch of Highway 71 late at night. I always slow down as I approach the spot where it happened, half expecting to see that hulking shape emerge from the shadows. So far, I haven't seen anything out of the ordinary, but I can't shake the feeling that something is out there, watching and waiting in the darkness beyond the tree line. I don't know if I'll ever have answers about what really happened that night, but I do know that it changed me forever. I no longer take for granted that we understand everything about the world around us. There are things out there beyond our comprehension, lurking just out of sight, and sometimes, if we're unlucky, we catch a glimpse of them. So if you're ever driving down a lonely stretch of road late at night, keep your eyes open. You never know what might be waiting around the next bend. And if you do see something you can't explain, know that you're not alone. There are others out there who have seen the impossible too. We may not have all the answers, but at least we can take comfort in knowing we're not crazy. The truth is out there. We just have to be brave enough to face it. Story 11. Around 11 p.m., I was making my final rounds before calling it a night. The park was dead silent, except for the occasional chirp of crickets and rustling of leaves in the breeze. As I walked past the row of trailers on the eastern edge, something caught my eye in the tree line about 50 yards away. At first I thought it was just a shadow, or maybe my tired eyes playing tricks on me. But then I saw it move, a massive grey figure, easily 8 or 9 feet tall, lumbering between the trees. My blood ran cold and I froze in place, afraid to even breathe. It walked with an odd, swaying gait, almost like a gorilla but more upright. In the dim moonlight filtering through the trees, I could make out broad, muscular shoulders that had to be at least 4 feet across. The thing was covered in silvery white hair that seemed to shimmer as it moved. For a split second, it turned its head in my direction, and I swear those eyes locked right onto me. They glowed with an eerie yellowish light, like a cat's eyes reflecting in the dark. A primal fear gripped me, and every instinct screamed at me to run. But I couldn't move a muscle. Just as quickly as it appeared, the creature melted back into the shadows of the forest. I stood there for what felt like hours, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally snapped out of it, I hightailed it back to the main office and locked myself inside for the rest of the night. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, or maybe I'd dozed off and had some kind of waking nightmare. But deep down, I knew what I saw was real. The next morning, I hesitantly mentioned it to my coworker Jim when he came in for the day shift. I was worried he'd think I was crazy, but to my shock he went pale and said he'd seen something similar a few nights before while taking out the trash. He hadn't said anything because he thought no one would believe him. Over the next couple weeks, 2 other employees, Dick and Frank, reported seeing the creature as well. Word started to spread among the residents too. People were on edge, keeping their kids close and locking their doors at night. One evening, a local science teacher named Dick Brown was visiting his sister who lived in the park. He happened to be outside when the creature emerged from the woods again. Being a logical, scientific type, he kept his cool enough to really study it. He estimated it was between 8 to 9 feet tall, based on how it compared to nearby trees. The shoulders were immensely broad and muscular, close to 4 feet across. The hair covering its body was white with silvery tips and about 8 inches long. But the thing that stuck with him most was the way it moved. He said it had a fluid, almost graceful gait despite its massive size, like it was perfectly adapted to moving silently through dense forest. As the sightings continued, tension in the park reached a fever pitch. Some residents moved out, afraid for their safety. Others started carrying guns or keeping baseball bats by their doors. A few of the braver or crazier folks even tried to organize hunting parties to track the thing down. I'll never forget the night of June 28th. It was unusually cool for summer, with a thick fog rolling in off the mountains. I was locking up the maintenance shed around 10 p.m. when I heard twigs snapping in the woods nearby. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I knew instantly what it was. I slowly turned around, and there it was, not 30 feet away from me. In the misty darkness, its massive form looked more like a living shadow than a flesh and blood creature. But those eyes, God, those glowing yellow eyes, bored right into my soul. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I was paralyzed with fear, my mind reeling as I tried to process what I was seeing. Then it took a step towards me, and I broke. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, not daring to look back until I was safely inside my trailer with the door locked behind me. The next morning, we found massive footprints in the mud near the maintenance shed. They were over 20 inches long and nearly a foot wide. Whatever this thing was, it was real, and it was right in our backyard. After that night, the sightings abruptly stopped. It was like the creature vanished into thin air. Some folks were relieved, but for me the silence was almost worse. At least before we knew where it was. Now it could be anywhere, watching us from the shadows. In the years since, I've tried to make sense of what we saw that summer. Was it some kind of unknown primate? An escaped government experiment? Or something else entirely, beyond our understanding? I've read about similar sightings in other parts of the country, creatures they call Bigfoot or Sasquatch, but none of those stories quite match up with what we encountered. This thing was different somehow. More alien. To this day, I can't explain what happened at Pinewood Trailer Park in the summer of '71. All I know is that it was real, and it changed me forever. I still wake up in a cold sweat some nights, those glowing yellow eyes seared into my memory. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, sometimes I have a hard time believing it myself. But I know what I saw, and I know that somewhere out there, in the vast wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, that creature is still out there, watching, waiting, for what I don't know, and that uncertainty haunts me more than anything else. Story 12. As I approached the bean field, something caught my eye that made me stop dead in my tracks. At first, I thought maybe some local kids had been messing around in the field overnight, but as I got closer, I realized these weren't any normal footprints I was looking at. My heart started racing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. There were hundreds of them, huge, strange-looking footprints all over my bean field. I'd never seen anything like it before. Each print was enormous, easily over a foot long, but it wasn't just the size that was bizarre. These prints only had 3 toes, which struck me as really odd. And the toes were all about the same size. There wasn't a big toe or little toe like you'd expect to see. I crouched down to examine them more closely, my mind racing, trying to figure out what could have made tracks like this. The impressions were deep. Whatever left them must have been incredibly heavy. Based on how far down they sunk into the soft soil, I estimated it had to weigh at least 300 pounds, probably more. As I followed the trail of prints, I noticed something else strange. They formed an almost perfect circle around the field. But here's the really weird part. It was like whatever made them was deliberately avoiding stepping on the bean plants. The prints weaved carefully between the rows, never crushing a single sprout. It gave me chills, thinking about the level of intelligence that would take. I spent the next couple hours meticulously examining every print and taking measurements. They were consistently about 13-14 inches long. I used some string to measure the stride length between prints. It was huge, way longer than a normal human's stride. Whatever made these clearly had an immense reach. As the day wore on, I started to feel more and more uneasy. The sheer number of prints meant this thing, whatever it was, had spent a significant amount of time in my field last night, and I hadn't heard a thing. How could something that big move so quietly? I decided to call my neighbor Bob to come take a look. When he arrived about an hour later, his jaw dropped as soon as he saw the prints. "What in God's name?" he muttered as he crouched down to examine them. We spent the next few hours discussing what could have possibly made the tracks, but came up empty. It clearly wasn't any known animal in these parts. As the sun started to set, an eerie feeling settled over me. Whatever had been here last night might come back after dark. I sure as hell didn't want to be out in that field if it did. Bob and I decided to set up a few trail cameras around the perimeter just in case. That night, I barely slept a wink. Every little sound outside had me on edge. I kept imagining some massive three-toed creature lurking in the shadows just beyond my window. When my alarm went off at dawn, I was already wide awake. I raced out to the field as soon as there was enough light to see. My heart was pounding as I approached, both dreading and anticipating what I might find. But when I got there, everything looked exactly the same as the day before. No new prints, no damage to the plants, nothing. It was almost more unsettling that way, like the whole thing had been some sort of strange dream. Over the next few weeks, I obsessively checked the field multiple times a day. I developed the film from the trail cameras, but they hadn't captured anything unusual. I even contacted some wildlife experts and showed them photos of the prints, but none of them could identify what might have made them. As time passed and there were no further incidents, life slowly started to return to normal. But I never forgot about those massive three-toed prints. To this day, I still get a chill down my spine when I walk through that bean field. Sometimes at night I'll wake up suddenly, sure that I heard heavy footsteps outside, but I never see anything. I've replayed that June morning over and over in my head for years now, trying to make sense of it. Part of me wishes I'd seen the creature that made those prints, but another part of me is terrified at the thought of coming face to face with something that massive and unknown. I know some folks in town think I made the whole thing up or that I was seeing things, but I know what I saw. Those prints were real, and they were made by something that shouldn't exist. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, silently roaming the forests and fields at night while we sleep unaware. All I know for certain is that there are things in this world we don't understand, and sometimes it's better not to go looking for answers. But I'll never forget that summer morning when I realized just how strange and mysterious our world can be. Those three-toed prints left an impression on me that will last a lifetime. Story 13. I'll never forget that day in September 1969. I was just a kid, maybe 8 or 9 years old, on a camping trip with my dad in Humboldt County, California. We were hiking along a creek in the Klamath River area. It was a beautiful sunny day, and I was having the time of my life exploring nature with my father. Dad was a forest scientist, always teaching me about the plants and animals we'd come across. He had this calm, rational way about him that made me feel safe, like he understood everything about the wilderness. But what happened that day shook him in a way I'd never seen before, and it's haunted me ever since. We were walking along the sandy bank of the creek, looking for interesting rocks and leaves, when suddenly Dad stopped short. I nearly bumped into him. He was staring down at something in the sand with this look of disbelief on his face. When I followed his gaze, I saw them, a line of absolutely massive footprints pressed deep into the wet sand. At first I thought they must be bear tracks, but they looked different. The shape was all wrong, more like a giant human foot. And they were huge, way bigger than any bear print I'd ever seen. Each one was easily twice the size of my dad's boot. I remember feeling a chill run down my spine as I looked at those alien-looking prints. But what really scared me was my dad's reaction. He was always so calm and collected, explaining everything scientifically. But in that moment he looked genuinely afraid. His face had gone pale and he was breathing hard, like he'd just run a long way. "Dad?" I said, tugging on his sleeve. "What made those?" He didn't answer at first. just kept staring at the prints with wide eyes. Then he seemed to snap out of it and grabbed my hand. "We need to go, now." His voice was tense in a way I'd never heard before. "But what about—" "Now, sweetie, let's go." He started pulling me back the way we came, walking so fast I had to jog to keep up. I kept looking back over my shoulder at those huge, mysterious prints. "Dad, what were those? Were they from a really big bear?" I was out of breath from trying to match his pace. "I don't know," he said curtly, "but we need to get back to camp." The whole way back, Dad kept glancing around nervously, like he expected something to jump out at us at any moment. I'd never seen him like that before, and it scared me more than the footprints had. When we got back to our campsite, he immediately started packing up our gear. "What are you doing?" I asked, confused. "I thought we were staying another night." "Change of plans," he said, not meeting my eyes. "We're heading home early." As we drove away from the campground, I kept pestering him with questions about what we'd seen, but he wouldn't give me a straight answer. Finally, he turned to me with a serious expression. "Listen to me carefully," he said. "I don't want you to tell anyone about what we saw today. Not your friends, not your teachers, not even Mom, okay? It's very important." I nodded, wide-eyed. "Okay, Dad, but why?" He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. Sometimes it's better not to talk about things we don't understand. Just promise me, okay?" "I promise," I said solemnly, though I didn't really understand. The rest of the drive home was tense and quiet. I could tell Dad was still on edge, constantly checking the rearview mirror. When we got home, he seemed to relax a bit, but there was still something off about him. He never brought up the incident again. For years afterwards, I'd have nightmares about those footprints. In my dreams, I'd be following the tracks through a misty forest, always catching glimpses of something large moving just out of sight. I'd wake up in a cold sweat. The image of those massive, inhuman prints burned into my mind. As I got older, I tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it really had just been unusually large bear tracks, and my childish imagination had blown it out of proportion. But I couldn't shake the memory of my dad's fear. He was a scientist, a man who believed in facts and evidence. What could have scared him so badly? When I was in my teens, I finally worked up the courage to ask him about it again. We were on another camping trip, this time just a weekend getaway. As we sat by the campfire, I broached the subject. "Dad," I said hesitantly, "do you remember that time we went camping when I was little, in Humboldt County?" He looked at me quizzically. "We went camping a lot when you were young. Any particular trip?" "The one where we saw those big footprints by the creek," I prompted. "You got really scared and we left early. Remember?" A strange look passed over his face just for a moment. Then he shook his head and smiled. "Oh, that. We probably just saw some bear tracks. Nothing to get worked up about." But I could tell he was lying. There was a tension in his voice, a flicker in his eyes that told me he remembered exactly what we'd seen. He just didn't want to talk about it. "But Dad, they weren't bear tracks. They were—" He cut me off abruptly. "It was a long time ago, sweetie. Memory plays tricks on us. I'm sure it was just a bear." And that was that. He wouldn't discuss it further, changing the subject to my upcoming school year. But I knew what I'd seen. Those weren't bear tracks, and my dad's reaction hadn't been about a bear. Over the years, I've done a lot of research into unexplained phenomena in that area. I've read about Bigfoot sightings, strange creatures in the woods, unexplained footprints. Some of it seems far-fetched, but then I remember that day by the creek and I wonder. I'm an adult now, with kids of my own. I've never told them about what happened that day. Part of me wants to protect them from the fear and uncertainty I've lived with, but another part of me wonders if I'm doing them a disservice. If there really is something out there in the woods, shouldn't they know? Sometimes when we're out hiking as a family, I'll catch myself scanning the tree line, looking for movement. My husband thinks I'm just being cautious about bears or mountain lions, but I'm looking for something else, something I can't quite explain. I've never seen anything like those footprints again, never had any other strange encounters in the woods, but that one experience changed how I see the world. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things out there we can't explain, things that defy our understanding of what's normal or possible. My dad passed away a few years ago. In his final days, when he was in and out of lucidity, he said something that chilled me to the bone. I was sitting by his hospital bed holding his hand when he suddenly gripped my arm tightly. "The woods," he said, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Be careful in the woods. They're out there, watching, waiting." Then he seemed to come back to himself and gave me a confused smile. "Sorry, sweetheart. Must have dozed off there for a minute." But I knew he hadn't been sleeping. In that moment of vulnerability, some deep-buried truth had surfaced. Whatever we saw that day in 1969, it was real, and it had haunted my father for his entire life, just as it's haunted me. I still go camping, I still love the outdoors, but now, whenever I'm in the woods, I'm always aware that I might not be alone, that there might be eyes watching from the shadows, massive feet leaving prints in the soft earth. And I wonder, if I ever see those prints again, will I have the courage to follow them? Or will I, like my father, choose to turn away and pretend it never happened? Some mysteries are better left unsolved, but others nag at you, demanding answers. The incident by the creek falls into the latter category for me. I may never know exactly what we encountered that day, but I know it was real, and I know it was something beyond our normal understanding of the world. So if you're ever hiking in the woods of Humboldt County, keep your eyes open, and if you see a set of impossibly large human-like footprints, well, you'll understand why my heart races every time I step into the forest. Some encounters change you forever, leaving you with questions that can never be fully answered. Story 14. We'd set up camp earlier that day, pitching our tents in a small clearing surrounded by towering redwoods. Dad had strung up our food in a bag between two trees to keep it safe from bears. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire, laughing and joking as we made s'mores. Eventually, everyone started getting sleepy and headed off to bed. I lay in my sleeping bag for what felt like hours, unable to drift off. The woods seemed different at night. Every rustle and crack made me jump. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed some fresh air. Careful not to wake my little brother snoring next to me, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The night was cool and misty, moonlight filtering through the canopy above. I took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill my lungs. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling sound coming from the edge of our campsite. My heart started racing. Was it a bear? I crept forward, peering into the shadows, and then I saw them. Two massive fur-covered creatures were standing by our food bag. One was taller than the other, easily over 8 feet. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Their bodies were covered in thick, dark hair. Long arms hung below their knees, but it was their faces that made my blood run cold. Distinctly ape-like, yet somehow human. I stood there frozen, afraid to move or even breathe. The creatures seemed to be communicating with each other, making low grunting noises as they gestured with their huge hands. Were they trying to get our food? I couldn't tear my eyes away. Suddenly, a twig snapped under my foot. The sound was deafening in the quiet night. Both creatures whipped their heads around to stare directly at me. I gasped involuntarily, terror gripping every inch of my body. In that moment, Time seemed to stand still. I stared into their eyes, dark and intelligent, filled with an awareness that chilled me to my core. They weren't animals, but they weren't human either. What were they? Then, in the blink of an eye, they were gone. No sound, no movement. They simply vanished into the darkness. I stood there, shaking, trying to process what I'd just seen. Part of me wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. But I knew deep down it was real. I don't know how long I stayed out there, rooted to the spot. Eventually, I managed to stumble back to the tent on wobbly legs. I crawled into my sleeping bag, pulling it tight around me as if it could protect me from what I'd witnessed. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those creatures staring back at me. Their eyes haunted me. As the sun began to rise, I heard my family stirring. For a moment, I considered telling them what happened. But who would believe me? They'd think I was making it up, or that I'd had a nightmare. So I kept quiet. We packed up camp and headed home like nothing had happened. But everything had changed for me. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. I scoured books and newspapers, trying to find any information about strange creatures in the woods. That's when I first learned about Bigfoot. The more I read, the more convinced I became that's what I'd encountered that night. But it wasn't just one. There were two of them. And they seemed intelligent, like they were having a conversation. It went against everything I'd heard about Bigfoot being a solitary, animal-like creature. For years, I kept the experience to myself. I was afraid people would think I was crazy if I told them. But it never left me. Even now, decades later, I can close my eyes and see those creatures as clearly as if it happened yesterday. The worst part is the not knowing. What were they really? Where did they come from? How could they disappear so quickly and silently? I've spent countless hours trying to make sense of it all. I've heard other stories over the years of Bigfoot encounters. Some sound similar to mine, others wildly different. But none can quite capture the sheer terror and awe I felt that night. It was like coming face to face with the impossible. Sometimes I wonder if they're still out there, hidden away in the vast wilderness. Do they remember me? That scared little girl who stumbled upon their late-night meeting? Or am I just one of many humans they've encountered over the years? I've been back to Shasta County a few times since then, always half hoping and half dreading that I'll see them again. But the woods have remained silent, keeping their secrets. That night changed me forever. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there's so much we don't understand about our world. I've become more open-minded, more willing to believe in the unexplained, because I know firsthand that sometimes the impossible becomes reality. I still struggle with whether I should have told someone back then. Maybe if I had, we'd have proof now. But at the time, the fear of ridicule was too strong. And honestly, part of me feels protective of whatever I saw that night. They didn't harm us or our campsite. They were just there. Even now, I'm hesitant to share my story. I know there will be skeptics, people who'll say I imagined it or that I'm lying. But I know what I saw. Those creatures were real as the ground beneath my feet. I often wonder if anyone else has had a similar experience in that area. Have others seen these creatures and, like me, kept it to themselves out of fear or disbelief? How many encounters go unreported because people are afraid of not being believed? The experience has left me with a deep respect for the unknown. I've learned that just because we can't explain something doesn't mean it isn't real. There's so much about our world that we don't understand, so many mysteries still waiting to be uncovered. That night in the woods of Shasta County opened my eyes to a world beyond what I thought I knew. It's a memory that's both terrifying and awe-inspiring, a moment that shaped the course of my life in ways I'm still discovering. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what I saw that night, but I do know that it was real, and it was extraordinary. And no matter how many years pass, I'll never forget the night I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist, but does. Story 15. We were out in the field, practicing defensive positions after dark. Me and another guy, Johnson, were paired up and hunkered down in our foxhole. It was a cold, clear night, and everything was quiet except for the occasional rustling of leaves or snapping of twigs from small animals. Around 2 a.m. I had this overwhelming feeling that something was watching us. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt my heart start racing. I nudged Johnson and whispered for him to stay alert. We both scanned the darkness, straining our eyes and ears for any sign of movement. That's when I saw it. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but as I stared harder I realized there was definitely something there. A massive dark shape, easily 8 or 9 feet tall, was slowly moving through the trees about 50 yards away. I froze, not daring to move a muscle. As it got closer, I could make out more details. This thing was huge, at least 3 feet wide across the shoulders. It walked upright on 2 legs, but the movements were fluid and silent. No human could move like that, especially not someone that big. The head was what really got me. It was oddly pointed at the top, almost conical. I couldn't make out any facial features in the darkness, just that bizarre skull shape. Johnson saw it too. I heard him let out a tiny gasp beside me. We were both trained Marines, used to staying calm under pressure, but in that moment we were paralyzed with fear. This creature was like nothing I'd ever seen before. It radiated raw power and an almost otherworldly presence. The strangest part was how quiet it was. Something that size should have been snapping branches and rustling leaves with every step, but it moved through the brush without making a sound. I couldn't even hear it breathing. As it got closer, passing within about 20 feet of our position, I braced myself for it to catch our scent. But there was nothing, no odor at all. It was as if this thing wasn't fully there, like some kind of phantom. It walked right between Johnson and me, so close I could have reached out and touched it. Neither of us moved a muscle or made a sound. I was barely even breathing, terrified that the slightest noise would make it notice us. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds or so, it disappeared into the darkness on the other side of the clearing. Johnson and I stayed frozen for a long time after, afraid to even whisper. When we finally worked up the courage to speak, we both agreed on what we'd seen, though neither of us could explain it. We debated whether to report it, but who would believe us? We were Marines, not some backwoods hicks claiming to see Bigfoot. So we kept it to ourselves, though the memory of that night stayed with me. Over the years, I've tried to rationalize what I saw. Maybe it was just a bear walking upright, or some kind of elaborate prank. But deep down, I know it was something else, something that shouldn't exist in our world. I've heard other stories since then of similar encounters in the area. Camp Pendleton is a big place, with lots of wild, undeveloped land. Who knows what could be living out there, hidden away from human eyes? To this day, I get chills thinking about that massive, silent shape moving through the trees. The pointed head, the fluid movements, the complete lack of scent. It was like seeing a ghost, but one made of flesh and blood. I don't go camping anymore. Can't stand being out in the woods at night. The rational part of my brain says there's nothing to be afraid of. But another part, the part that remembers that cold November night, knows better. There are things out there that we can't explain, things that defy our understanding of the natural world. I'm an old man now, and I've seen a lot in my life. But nothing compares to those few moments in 1968 when I came face to face with something truly unexplainable. I don't know what it was, and part of me doesn't want to know. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, but I'll never forget that night, or the way that creature moved. Silent, powerful, impossible. It changed the way I see the world, made me realize that there's more out there than we can ever truly understand. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, sometimes I have trouble believing it myself. But I know what I saw, and I know that somewhere out there, in the wild places of the world, there are things beyond our comprehension, things that walk in the shadows, just out of sight. So if you're ever out in the woods at night, and you get that feeling of being watched, trust your instincts. There might be more truth to those old legends than we'd like to admit, and some creatures are better left undisturbed. I've never told this story publicly before. For years I kept it bottled up inside, afraid of being labeled crazy or attention-seeking. But as I get older, I feel a need to share my experience. Not to convince anyone, but just to get it off my chest. Sometimes I wonder if that creature is still out there, roaming the wilderness of Camp Pendleton. Part of me hopes it is. There's something comforting about the idea that there are still mysteries in the world, things that science can't explain. But another part of me hopes I imagined the whole thing, because if that creature was real, if there really are things like that living alongside us, then the world is a much stranger and more dangerous place than we realize. I don't have any answers, just the memory of that night burned into my mind like a photograph, the massive silhouette, the pointed head, the silent movement. It's an image that's haunted me for over 50 years now. So that's my story. Take from it what you will. But if you ever find yourself in the wilderness at night, keep your eyes open and your wits about you, because you never know what might be watching from the shadows. Story 16. My brother Richard and I had decided to take a camping trip in Trinity National Forest with our friend Sharon. We were all in our early 20s and loved getting out into nature whenever we could. The forest was beautiful that time of year, towering redwoods, crystal clear streams, and hardly anyone else around. We found a nice secluded spot to set up camp, away from any established campgrounds or trails. As night fell, we sat around the campfire, enjoying some beers and telling stories. The stars were incredibly bright out there, away from any light pollution. It was a warm night, with just a slight breeze rustling through the trees. Everything seemed perfect. Around 11 p.m., Sharon suddenly went very still and quiet. She was staring intently at something behind me, up on a small hill about 150 feet from our campsite. I turned to look, but couldn't see anything in the darkness. "What is it?" I asked. "There's something up there," Sharon whispered. "I can see a shape. It's big." Richard and I strained our eyes, trying to make out what she was seeing. After a few moments, I caught a glimpse of movement, a massive, dark silhouette shifting slightly against the night sky. My heart started pounding. "Holy shit," Richard muttered. "What the hell is that?" Without really thinking, I stood up and took a few steps towards the hill. I wanted to get a better look, to try and make sense of what we were seeing. As I moved closer, I heard a low, rumbling growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Then suddenly, a large rock came hurtling out of the darkness, landing with a thud about 7 feet in front of me. I stumbled backwards, nearly falling over in shock. "Ben, get back here!" Sharon hissed urgently. I quickly retreated to the campfire, my legs shaking. We huddled together, straining to see into the surrounding forest. The shape on the hill had disappeared, but now we could hear movement in the woods all around us. Branches snapping, heavy footsteps, more of those deep, guttural vocalizations. "We need to get out of here," Richard said, his voice tight with fear. But as we looked around, we realized we were surrounded. In the faint glow of the dying campfire, we could make out massive, shadowy figures moving between the trees. And then I saw the eyes, 4 pairs of glowing red eyes, staring at us from different directions. They seemed to float in the darkness, bobbing slightly as the creatures moved. I've never felt terror like that before or since. We were totally exposed with nowhere to run. These things, whatever they were, had us completely surrounded. And they were huge, easily 8 to 10 feet tall, with broad, powerful shoulders. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out more details. Their heads were oddly shaped, almost like inverted teardrops. And their faces, God, their faces. They were almost human-like, but hairless and with exaggerated features. Wide, flared nostrils, deep-set eyes, heavy brow ridges. For what felt like hours, we sat frozen in fear as these creatures circled our camp. Sometimes they'd come closer, close enough that we could hear their heavy breathing and smell their musty, animal-like odor. Other times they'd retreat into the woods, but we could still hear them moving about, communicating with each other through a series of whoops and grunts. I remember Sharon sobbing quietly, her whole body shaking. Richard had his arm around her, but I could see the terror in his eyes too. I felt completely helpless. These things could have easily overpowered us at any moment. Why were they just watching us? What did they want? As the night wore on, exhaustion began to set in. But none of us dared to sleep. We took turns watching, always keeping an eye on those glowing red eyes in the darkness. I don't think I've ever been so grateful to see the first light of dawn. As the sky began to lighten, the creatures gradually retreated further into the woods. Their eyes disappeared one by one until finally we couldn't see or hear them anymore. We waited until the sun was fully up before we dared to move. Our campsite was a mess. Deep footprints surrounded the area, some right up to the edge of our sleeping bags. Trees and bushes had been broken and pushed aside, and the smell, that musky, wild odor, still lingered in the air. We packed up as quickly as we could and got the hell out of there. The hike back to our car was tense. Every snapping twig or rustling bush made us jump. But we made it without incident. For weeks afterwards, I had terrible nightmares. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I could see those red eyes staring at me from the darkness. Sharon refused to go camping ever again. Richard threw himself into researching, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. We reported our experience to the local sheriff, but they just laughed it off. Said we must have been drinking too much or got spooked by some bears. But we know what we saw. Those weren't bears. They weren't anything I'd ever seen before or since. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night in Trinity National Forest. Why did those creatures surround us but never attack? What were they? I've read about Bigfoot sightings over the years, and some details match up. But nothing I've read quite captures the sheer terror of that night, the feeling of being watched and hunted by something that shouldn't exist. I still love the outdoors, but I've never been able to shake that feeling of vulnerability when I'm in the wilderness. Every time I'm in the woods and hear an unexpected sound, my mind immediately goes back to that night, to those glowing red eyes and those massive shadowy figures. I don't know if I'll ever have answers about what really happened, but I know what I saw, what we all saw, and I'll never forget it as long as I live. Story 17. We'd set out early that crisp October morning, hoping to bag an elk before the first major snowfall hit. The air was sharp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and wood smoke from our camp. As we hiked up into the hills, I remember feeling on edge, like something wasn't quite right. The forest seemed unusually quiet, no birds calling, no small animals scurrying through the underbrush. Just an eerie stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. By mid-afternoon, we'd covered a fair bit of ground without any luck. We were taking a break, scanning a steep, rocky slope about 500 yards away through our binoculars. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, a dark figure moving along the ridgeline with unnatural speed and agility. "Hey, Dad," I whispered, not wanting to startle whatever it was. "Take a look over there and tell me what you see." He raised his binoculars, squinting as he followed my gaze. After a few moments, he let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. The figure was massive, easily 8 feet tall, maybe more. My dad stood 6'2", and this thing dwarfed him. It moved with long, smooth strides, effortlessly navigating the treacherous terrain as if it were level ground. No human could move like that, especially not on such a steep, boulder-strewn slope. As we watched in stunned silence, it paused for a moment, seeming to survey the valley below. Though it was too far away to make out details, I had the distinct impression it was looking right at us. A chill ran down my spine. Then, in the blink of an eye, it vanished into the tree line. "What the hell was that?" I breathed, my heart pounding. My dad shook his head slowly. "I don't know, son, but I think we'd better head back to camp." That night around the fire, we debated what we'd seen. My uncle insisted it must have been a bear, but we all knew that was impossible. Bears don't walk upright like that, and they certainly don't move with such fluid grace on 2 legs. Dad was uncharacteristically quiet, puffing on his pipe with a faraway look in his eyes. I barely slept that night, jumping at every snapping twig or rustle of wind through the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The next day passed uneventfully, though the usual enthusiasm for our hunt was gone. We went through the motions, but our minds were clearly elsewhere. As dusk approached, we decided to call it quits and head back to the main road in the morning. We broke camp before dawn, wanting to get an early start on the long drive home. A light snow had fallen overnight, dusting the ground and trees with a delicate white frosting. As we navigated the winding dirt road in our old pickup, headlights cutting through the pre-dawn gloom, we rounded a bend and saw something that made my blood run cold. There, illuminated in the beams of our headlights, was an enormous footprint in the fresh snow. It had to be at least 18 inches long, with 5 distinct toes clearly visible. Before we could process what we were seeing, movement caught my eye. About 50 yards ahead, a massive dark shape was crossing the road. It moved with that same fluid gait we'd witnessed on the mountain slope. In 3 long strides, it had crossed the entire width of the road and disappeared into the thick forest on the other side. Dad slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding slightly on the snowy surface. We sat there in shocked silence for what felt like an eternity, staring at the spot where the creature had vanished. Finally, my uncle spoke up from the back seat. Did you boys see that?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Dad nodded slowly, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Yeah, we saw it." I don't remember much about the rest of that drive home. We didn't talk much, each lost in our own thoughts. I know we stopped to examine the footprint more closely, but it had already begun to melt and distort in the morning sun. In the years since, I've tried to rationalize what we saw. Maybe it was just a bear walking oddly, or some kind of elaborate hoax. But deep down, I know the truth. There's something out there in those mountains, something that defies explanation. I've never gone back to that part of Kuster County. The memory of that hulking figure, moving with impossible speed and grace, is forever etched in my mind. Sometimes on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I swear I can hear the echo of heavy footsteps and catch a whiff of a musky animal scent. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, most days I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what I saw, what we all saw. And I know that there are things in this world that we can't explain, things that lurk in the shadows of our so-called civilization. To this day, I can't look at the mountains without wondering what secrets they hold. And I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, in the vast wilderness, something is watching and waiting, something that doesn't want to be found. I've never shared this story publicly before. It's not the kind of thing you bring up in polite conversation, but lately I've been hearing more and more reports of similar sightings in the area. It makes me wonder if others have encountered the same creature we did all those years ago. Sometimes I think about going back, trying to find some kind of evidence or explanation for what we saw. But then I remember the primal fear I felt that morning, the way my entire body screamed at me to run and never look back. And I know that some mysteries are better left unsolved. So I'll keep this story to myself, a secret shared only with those who were there that day. But every time I hear about a strange sighting in the mountains or catch a glimpse of an unusually large footprint on a hiking trail, I'm transported back to that snowy morning in Kuster County. And I wonder if, somewhere out there, that creature is still roaming the wilderness, a living legend that most people will never believe exists. Story 18. I still remember that day like it was yesterday, even though it's been over 40 years. February 17th, 1979, a date forever etched in my mind. I was just 8 years old, living with my parents in a small house on the outskirts of McCall, Idaho. It was a typical cold winter morning in Valley County, with snow piled high outside our windows. I was sitting on the living room floor, watching Saturday morning cartoons as usual. Mom was in the kitchen making breakfast, and Dad had already left for work at the lumber mill. Everything seemed normal, but there was an eerie stillness in the air that I can't quite explain. As I sat there engrossed in my show, something caught my eye in the reflection on the TV screen. A dark shape moved past the window behind me. At first, I thought it was just a tree branch swaying in the wind. But then I saw it again. Definitely not a branch. My heart started racing as I slowly turned around to look out the window. That's when I saw it, and my blood ran cold. There, peering in through the glass, was the most terrifying face I've ever seen. It looked almost like a gorilla, but different. The face was broader, with a pronounced brow ridge and a wide, flat nose. But the eyes, those eyes were what really got me. They weren't animal eyes. There was an intelligence there, an awareness that sent chills down my spine. The creature must have been at least 8 feet tall to be looking down into our window like that. Its entire head and upper body were covered in dark, matted fur. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I was frozen in fear, unable to move or make a sound. Then it blinked, and I saw its massive hand press against the window. The glass actually creaked under the pressure. That's when I finally found my voice and tried to scream for my mom. But all that came out was a strangled whimper. The creature's eyes widened at the sound. It quickly pulled back from the window and disappeared from view. I heard heavy footsteps crunching in the snow as it ran off. I sat there trembling for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a minute or two. Finally, I managed to scramble to my feet and run to the kitchen. "Mom! Mom!" I cried, latching onto her leg. She turned from the stove, startled. "What's wrong, sweetie? You look like you've seen a ghost." I tried to explain what had happened, but I was sobbing so hard the words wouldn't come out right. Mom knelt down and hugged me tight, trying to calm me down. "Shh, it's okay. Take a deep breath and tell me what happened," she soothed. Between hiccuping sobs, I managed to get the story out. There was a monster at the window. It was huge and hairy, and it was looking right at me. Mom's brow furrowed with concern. She stood up and went to look out the kitchen window, then walked through the house, checking all the other windows. When she came back, she tried to reassure me. "I don't see anything out there, honey. Are you sure it wasn't just your imagination? Or maybe a bear?" But I was adamant. No, it wasn't a bear. It had a face like a person, but all hairy. And it was so big. Mom still looked skeptical, but she could see how genuinely terrified I was. She hugged me again and said, "Okay, sweetie, I believe that you saw something that scared you. Why don't we call your dad and see if he can come home early?" I nodded, clinging to her. She picked up the kitchen phone and dialed Dad's work number. I could hear the worry in her voice as she explained the situation to him. He said he'd be home as soon as he could. For the rest of the day, I refused to go anywhere near the windows. I kept imagining that I'd see that face staring in at me again. Mom tried to distract me with games and stories, but I was too shaken up. When Dad got home, he immediately went outside to look around. He came back in about 20 minutes later, his face grim. "I found some tracks in the snow," he said quietly to Mom. "Big ones, bigger than any animal I've ever seen around here. And they were bipedal, walking on 2 legs. Mom's eyes widened, and she glanced over at me. I was sitting on the couch, straining to hear their whispered conversation. Dad continued, "I followed them a ways into the woods, but then they just disappeared, like whatever made them just vanished into thin air. That night, I begged to sleep in my parents' room. Every little sound made me jump, convinced the creature had come back. I kept seeing those intelligent, almost human-like eyes every time I closed my own. The next few days were tense. Dad nailed sheets of plywood over the windows on that side of the house, just as a precaution. He also started keeping his hunting rifle closer at hand. Mom tried to keep things as normal as possible, but I could tell she was worried too. She kept the radio on all the time, listening for any news reports of strange sightings in the area. About a week after my encounter, Mom came home from grocery shopping with a strange look on her face. She was clutching a copy of the local newspaper. "You need to see this," she said to Dad, handing him the paper. The headline read, "Multiple Bigfoot sightings reported in Valley County." The article went on to describe several incidents over the past month where people had seen large, ape-like creatures in the forests around McCall and Donnelly. My parents exchanged a long look. Then Dad knelt down next to me and said, "Son, I think it's time we had a talk about what you saw." That was the first time they really, truly believed me. It was also the beginning of a lifelong fascination and fear of the unknown creatures that might be lurking in the forests of Idaho. In the years since, I've read every book and article I could find about Bigfoot and other cryptids. I've even gone on a few expeditions into the wilderness, hoping to catch another glimpse of the creature I saw that day. But I've never seen anything like it again. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember those eyes, so wild, yet so intelligent, and I know it was real. Whatever I saw that cold February morning was no figment of my imagination. It was something beyond our understanding, something that challenges everything we think we know about the natural world. I'm 51 years old now, with kids of my own. We still live in Idaho, though not in that same house. I've never told my children about what happened that day. Part of me wants to protect them from the fear and uncertainty I've lived with all these years. But another part of me thinks they deserve to know the truth, that there are things in this world we can't explain, things that defy our notion of what's possible. Maybe someday I'll tell them. For now, I carry the memory of that encounter with me, a secret knowledge that the world is stranger and more mysterious than most people ever realize. And every time I look out into the dense forests that surround our town, I can't help but wonder, is it out there, watching? Will I ever see those eyes again? The questions haunt me, even after all these years. One thing's for certain, that day changed my life forever. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are creatures out there, hidden from view, that we've yet to discover or understand. And while that thought terrifies me sometimes, it also fills me with a sense of wonder. Because if something like that can exist without our knowledge, what else might be out there, waiting to be found? Story 19. That particular night, I woke up suddenly around 3 a.m. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed my sleep. The house was dark and silent, and my husband was snoring softly beside me. But then I heard it. Faint shuffling noises coming from the living room. My heart started pounding. We lived pretty far from our nearest neighbors, so the idea of an intruder was terrifying. I lay there frozen, straining my ears. The noises continued, soft footsteps and what sounded like things being moved around. I wanted to wake my husband, but I was paralyzed with fear. What if it was an armed burglar? I was afraid any sound or movement would alert them to our presence. Suddenly, the bedroom door creaked open. I squeezed my eyes shut, pretending to be asleep. Heavy, shuffling footsteps entered the room. I could hear labored breathing, almost like panting. A musty, animal-like odor filled the air. Curiosity overcame my terror, and I opened my eyes just a crack. What I saw made my blood run cold. Standing at the foot of our bed was a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It was short, maybe 4 feet tall, but had a stocky, powerful build. Its entire body was covered in shaggy brown fur. But the face is what haunts me to this day. It had a somewhat flattened, ape-like face with a broad nose and a heavy brow. But the ears were huge and pointed, almost like a bat's. And the eyes, they were large and round, gleaming with intelligence in the darkness. As I watched in silent horror, the creature turned and caught sight of itself in the mirror on our dresser. It seemed fascinated by its own reflection, tilting its head this way and that. Then it reached up and thoughtfully scratched its chin in an eerily human-like gesture. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My mind was reeling, unable to process this impossible creature standing in my bedroom. Was I dreaming? Had I gone mad? But I could smell it, hear its breathing. This was real. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two, the creature turned and shuffled out of the bedroom. I heard it moving around the house for a few more minutes, and then silence fell. I lay there rigid with fear for the rest of the night, unable to move or wake my husband. When dawn finally came, I shakily got out of bed to investigate. There were muddy footprints on the floor and some objects knocked over in the living room, but no sign of the creature. When I told my husband what had happened, he was skeptical. He assumed I'd had a vivid nightmare, but those footprints were real. And in the days that followed, we kept finding strange tufts of coarse brown fur around the property. I spent weeks researching, trying to find any explanation for what I'd seen. The closest thing I could find were old legends of little people from Native American tribes in the area. But those stories described benevolent nature spirits, not the terrifying creature I encountered. I've gone over that night in my mind thousands of times in the years since. I've questioned my sanity, wondered if it was some kind of hallucination. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. That creature was flesh and blood, as solid and present as you or me. We moved away from that farmhouse soon after. I couldn't stand to be there anymore, always wondering if that thing would return. We never told anyone the real reason we left. Who would believe such an insane story? For years I was too afraid to talk about it. I thought people would think I was crazy. But recently I've started cautiously sharing my experience online, and I've been shocked to find others with similar encounters. It seems there are strange things out there that science can't explain. I still don't know what that creature was or where it came from. Some kind of undiscovered primate, an alien, a being from another dimension. I'll probably never know for sure, but I know what I saw that night, and the memory of those gleaming eyes and pointed ears still makes me shudder. I've never felt safe in the dark since then. I always sleep with a light on now, and loud noises at night send me into a panic. That one encounter changed me forever. It shattered my sense of reality and showed me that the world is far stranger and more mysterious than we realize. Sometimes I wish I could forget that night, go back to living in blissful ignorance. But at the same time, I feel like I've been given a glimpse behind the curtain of our reality. There are things out there beyond our understanding. I just hope I never encounter them again. I still have so many unanswered questions. Why did it come into our house that night? Was it just curious? Or did it have some purpose I couldn't comprehend? And why haven't I ever seen it again? Over the years, I've heard whispered stories of other sightings in that area of Idaho. Always at night, always brief encounters that leave people questioning their sanity. It makes me wonder, is there a whole population of these creatures out there, hidden from human eyes? Are they native to Earth, or visitors from somewhere else? I've become something of an amateur cryptozoologist since then, poring over reports of strange creature sightings around the world. So many of them share similarities with what I saw: the fur-covered bodies, the eerily human-like behavior. It's both frightening and oddly comforting to know I'm not alone in my experience. But no matter how much I research, I can never quite shake the visceral terror of that night. The way it moved, so quiet despite its bulk, the intelligence in its eyes, the casual way it examined itself in the mirror, as if it was used to seeing its own reflection. It's those little details that make it feel so real, even after all these years. I often wonder if it's still out there somewhere, maybe watching us from the shadows. Does it remember me too? Does it ever think about the night our worlds collided so briefly? I know this all sounds completely insane. Believe me, there are times I've questioned my own memory, wondered if somehow I imagined or exaggerated the whole thing. But then I'll catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, or hear an unexplained noise in the night, and that old fear comes rushing back. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I'm not even sure I would believe it if someone else told me this story. But I know what I saw, and I know that there are things in this world that defy explanation. My encounter may have been brief, but it changed my entire worldview. So I guess I'm sharing this as a warning, in a way. Keep your eyes open. Question what you think you know about reality, because you never know when you might stumble across something that challenges everything you believe. And if you're ever in rural Idaho on a dark night, maybe think twice before investigating any strange noises. You never know what might be lurking in the shadows. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Story 20. I'll never forget that summer day in 1944 on my grandpa's farm in Cass County, Michigan. I was just 10 years old at the time, spending a few weeks there with my family like we did every year. My cousin Billy, who was 12, was visiting too, and we loved exploring the woods together at the edge of the property. That particular afternoon was hot and sticky, the kind of day where your shirt clings to your back with sweat. Billy and I had been playing in the creek, trying to catch frogs and minnows. As the sun started to dip lower, we decided to head back towards the farmhouse for dinner. We were following a faint trail through the dense trees, swatting at mosquitoes and talking about what treats Grandma might have made for dessert. I remember the moment so clearly. I had stopped to retie my shoelace and was crouched down when I heard Billy gasp. I looked up at him and saw his eyes were wide, fixed on something behind me. I turned to see what he was staring at, and that's when I saw it. Standing about 50 feet away, partially obscured by a large oak tree, was the biggest person I'd ever seen. Except it wasn't really a person at all. This thing had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe even 9. It was absolutely massive, with broad shoulders and long arms. The creature was facing sideways, its profile visible to us. The first thing that struck me was the sheer size. It dwarfed the trees around it. But as my eyes adjusted, I started to notice other details. It was covered in dark, shaggy hair all over its body. The hair on its head was longer, hanging down past its shoulders. Its face was large and flat, with a prominent brow ridge. I couldn't make out distinct features, but I could see its eyes glinting as it looked in our direction. For a few heartbeats, we all just stood there, frozen. I was too shocked to even feel scared at first. It felt like time had stopped. Then the creature slowly turned its head and seemed to look right at us. A chill ran down my spine. Its gaze felt intelligent, almost curious. Suddenly it moved, turning away from us in one fluid motion. Its stride was long and graceful as it began walking deeper into the woods. I was mesmerized watching it move. Despite its huge size, it was incredibly agile, weaving between trees without making a sound. Billy grabbed my arm, snapping me out of my trance. "Run!" he hissed, and we both took off, sprinting back towards the farmhouse. My heart was pounding, and I could hear blood rushing in my ears. I kept expecting to hear heavy footsteps behind us, but there was nothing. We burst out of the tree line into the open field, gasping for breath. I glanced back, but saw no sign of the creature following. We didn't stop running until we reached the back porch, where we collapsed on the steps. Did you see that?" I panted, looking at Billy. His face was pale, and he nodded wordlessly. "We have to tell Grandpa," I said, starting to stand up. But Billy grabbed my wrist. "Wait," he said. "Do you really think they'll believe us? They'll just say we were playing make-believe." I hesitated. He had a point. The adults were always telling us our imaginations ran wild. But I knew what I saw was real. "We have to try," I insisted. "What if it comes closer to the house? What if it hurts someone?" Billy reluctantly agreed, and we went inside to find my grandpa. He was sitting at the kitchen table reading the newspaper. We blurted out our story, talking over each other in our excitement and fear. Grandpa listened patiently, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. When we finished, he sighed and folded his paper. "Now, kids," he said gently, "I know you two have quite the imagination, but there aren't any giant hairy men in these woods. You probably just saw a bear standing up, or maybe a large deer. Nothing to worry about." "But Grandpa, it wasn't a bear," I protested. "It walked on two legs and had a face like a person." He patted my head. "I'm sure it seemed very real to you. Why don't you go wash up for dinner? Your grandma made her famous apple pie for dessert." Billy and I looked at each other in frustration. I could tell he was thinking, "I told you so." We trudged upstairs to clean up, both of us quiet and lost in thought. That night I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature's face. I kept imagining it lurking just outside my window. I must have eventually dozed off, because I woke with a start in the early hours of the morning. At first I wasn't sure what had woken me. Then I heard it, a low, rumbling sound coming from outside. It wasn't quite a growl, but it wasn't human either. My blood ran cold. I slipped out of bed and crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. The moon was bright, casting long shadows across the yard. At first I didn't see anything unusual. Then movement caught my eye at the edge of the woods. My breath caught in my throat as I made out a large, dark shape moving between the trees. It was too far away to make out details, but I knew in my gut it was the same creature from earlier. I watched, paralyzed, as it emerged from the tree line. Even from a distance, its size was imposing. It stood still for a moment, as if surveying the farmhouse. Then it tilted its head back and let out a long, eerie howl. The sound sent shivers down my spine. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite animal and not quite human. I wanted to run and wake everyone up, but I was rooted to the spot. The creature began to move again, loping across the field with long, graceful strides. It was heading straight for the barn. Just as it reached the barn door, our old rooster started crowing. The creature froze, then quickly turned and ran back towards the woods. Within seconds, it had disappeared into the trees. I stayed at the window for what felt like hours, afraid to move. But nothing else happened. As the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I finally crawled back into bed, exhausted and shaken. The next morning at breakfast, I tried to tell my family what I'd seen, but as soon as I mentioned the creature, my mom cut me off. "That's enough of that nonsense," she said firmly. "I don't want to hear any more talk of monsters. You'll scare your little sister." I looked to Billy for support, but he just shrugged and focused on his eggs. I realized no one was going to believe me. For the rest of our stay at the farm, I was on edge. I refused to go into the woods again, making up excuses to stay close to the house. At night, I'd lie awake straining to hear any unusual sounds, but there were no more sightings or strange occurrences. As the years passed, I started to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe it really had just been a bear, and my young mind had twisted it into something more fantastical. But deep down, I knew what I saw was real. I'm an old woman now, and I've never told anyone else this story. Who would believe me? But sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still see that creature's face with perfect clarity. And on quiet nights, I swear I can hear that haunting howl echoing in the distance. I don't know what it was that I encountered that summer. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, some unknown species. I can't say for sure, but I know it was real, and the memory of it has stayed with me all these years. I often wonder if it's still out there, roaming the forests of Michigan, watching and waiting, and I wonder how many other people have seen it, but were too afraid to speak up and share their story. Story 21. I remember that summer of 1946 like it was yesterday. I was just 16 years old, spending time at my family's cabin near Cable Lake with my two best friends, Betty and Jean. We were inseparable that summer, always wandering the woods, swimming in the lake, and staying up late talking about boys and our dreams for the future. Little did we know that one evening would change our lives forever. It was a warm July day, and we had spent most of it lounging by the lake, soaking up the sun and gossiping. As the sun began to set, we decided to take a walk down the old dirt road that ran alongside the lake. The sky was painted in beautiful shades of orange and pink, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. It was the kind of evening that made you feel alive and full of possibilities. We were laughing and joking as we walked, our bare feet kicking up little puffs of dust from the road. I remember feeling so carefree and happy in that moment. But then, everything changed in an instant. As we rounded a bend in the road, we saw something that made us stop dead in our tracks. About 50 yards ahead of us, a massive, dark figure was lumbering across the road. At first, I thought it must be a bear. We'd seen plenty of those around the lake before. But as I looked closer, I realized this was something altogether different. The creature was enormous, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, and covered in thick, matted fur. It walked on 2 legs, but in a strange, shambling gait that was nothing like a human's. Its arms were impossibly long, nearly touching the ground as it moved. But it was the smell that hit us first, a horrific stench of rotting meat and musty animal fur that made my stomach turn. We stood there frozen, too terrified to move or speak. I felt Betty grab my arm, her nails digging into my skin. Jean let out a tiny whimper beside me. The creature paused in the middle of the road and slowly turned its head in our direction. In the fading light, I could make out 2 glowing eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other, 3 terrified teenage girls and this impossible monster. Then, With shocking speed for something so large, it darted off the road and into the thick forest beyond. The crashing sounds of it moving through the underbrush faded away, but we remained rooted to the spot, unable to process what we'd just seen. It was Jean who broke the silence first. What was that thing?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. I honestly had no idea how to answer her. Nothing in my 16 years of life had prepared me for what we'd just witnessed. Suddenly, Betty swayed beside me and then crumpled to the ground in a dead faint. The shock of her collapsing snapped me out of my daze. "Betty!" I cried, dropping to my knees beside her. Jean and I managed to revive her after a few terrifying moments, but she was pale and shaking. "The smell," she kept mumbling. "Oh God, that awful smell." We half-carried, half-dragged Betty back to our cabin as quickly as we could. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. Was it some kind of escaped circus animal? A hoax perpetrated by local pranksters? Or could it be the legendary monster of Lake Dewey that we'd heard whispered about by the old-timers in town? When we burst into the cabin, my parents took one look at our pale, terrified faces and knew something was wrong. Through tears and trembling voices, we managed to recount our experience on the road. I could tell by the looks on their faces that they didn't quite believe us, but they could see how genuinely frightened we were. My father, ever the practical one, decided to call the local sheriff. Within an hour, Sheriff Johnson arrived at our cabin, looking skeptical but concerned. He questioned us thoroughly, making us go over every detail again and again. I could tell he was trying to find holes in our story or some rational explanation for what we'd seen. "Now, girls," he said in that patronizing tone adults often use with teenagers, "are you sure it wasn't just a bear? They can look mighty strange in the twilight, you know." "It wasn't a bear," Jean insisted, her voice rising with frustration. "It was walking on two legs, and it was huge. And that smell, oh God, that horrible smell." The sheriff sighed and rubbed his forehead. All right. I'll tell you what. I'll gather some men, and we'll do a search of the area. If there's something out there, we'll find it." True to his word, Sheriff Johnson organized a search party. A group of about 10 men, armed with rifles and flashlights, combed the woods around Cable Lake for hours. My father went with them, leaving us girls huddled in the cabin with my mother, jumping at every little sound. As the night wore on, our fear began to mix with exhaustion. Betty had stopped shaking, but she was unnaturally quiet, her eyes distant. Jean paced back and forth, alternating between angry outbursts about how no one believed us and fearful glances out the window. I just sat there, replaying the encounter over and over in my mind, trying to make sense of it. It was nearly dawn when the search party returned, tired and empty-handed. They had found no trace of the creature, no tracks, no fur, nothing. The sheriff tried to reassure us, saying it was probably just our imaginations playing tricks on us in the twilight. But I knew what we had seen was real. The memory of those glowing eyes and that nauseating stench was burned into my mind. In the days that followed, word of our encounter spread through the small community around Cable Lake. Some people believed us, sharing their own stories of strange sightings and unexplained noises in the woods. Others laughed it off as the overactive imaginations of silly teenage girls, but no one could deny the fear that now hung over the area like a heavy fog. My parents tried to convince us to stay and finish our vacation, but none of us girls felt safe there anymore. Every rustle in the bushes, every shadow at dusk made us jump. We left the cabin a week early. Our carefree summer irrevocably changed. As the years passed, I tried to rationalize what we had seen that evening. Maybe it was just a bear, distorted by the fading light and our own fear. Maybe it was some kind of elaborate hoax. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was something out there in the woods around Cable Lake, something that defied explanation. I'm an old woman now, and I've never spoken publicly about what happened that summer. Who would believe the ramblings of an elderly lady about some monster she saw decades ago? But I know what I saw, what we all saw. And sometimes on quiet nights when the wind rustles through the trees outside my window, I'm transported back to that dirt road. I can see those glowing eyes, smell that horrific stench, and feel the terror that gripped us all. I've never returned to Cable Lake, and as far as I know, neither have Betty or Jean. Some experiences change you forever, leaving an indelible mark on your soul. That summer evening in 1946 was one such experience for me. I don't know what that creature was, or if it still roams the forests of Michigan, but I do know that there are things in this world that we can't explain, things that lurk just beyond the edge of our understanding, and sometimes, if we're not careful, we might just come face to face with them. Story 22. I still remember that summer day in Gaylord like it was yesterday, even though it's been over 70 years now. August 21st, 1950, a date forever seared into my memory. I was just a young fella back then, maybe 12 or 13 years old. We had this little cabin out in the woods that we'd go to on weekends to get away from it all. No electricity, no running water, just the peace and quiet of nature. That particular day started out normal enough. It was hot and sticky, the kind of muggy Michigan summer day where your shirt clings to your back with sweat. I'd been out exploring the woods most of the afternoon, as I often did. As evening approached, nature called and I headed out to use our rickety old outhouse a ways behind the cabin. Now, using an outhouse was never a pleasant experience, but it was all we had out there in the sticks. This one was your typical wooden shack with a bench seat and a hole cut in it. Always smelled awful, always had bugs buzzing around, but you got used to it. So there I was, doing my business and swatting at mosquitoes, when I heard something that made me freeze. It was a rustling sound coming from the woods behind the outhouse, like something big moving through the underbrush. At first, I figured it was probably just a deer or maybe a black bear. We'd see those around from time to time. But then I heard the unmistakable sound of branches snapping, like whatever it was had some serious weight to it. My heart started racing. This was no deer. The steps were too heavy, too purposeful. I sat there stock still, hardly daring to breathe. The footsteps drew closer and closer to the back of the outhouse. I could hear leaves crunching, twigs breaking underfoot. Whatever it was big. Panic gripped me. Should I call out, try to scare it away, or stay quiet and hope it passed by? My mind raced through the possibilities, each seeming worse than the last. The footsteps stopped right behind the outhouse. I could hear deep, raspy breathing, like a big animal panting. The walls of the outhouse seemed paper thin at that moment. I was sure that at any second, some massive creature was going to tear the whole structure apart with me still inside. I don't know what came over me then, but a sudden surge of courage, or maybe sheer terror, propelled me into action. In one swift move, I yanked up my pants and burst out the outhouse door, determined to face whatever was out there. What I saw in that moment will stay with me for the rest of my days. There, not 10 feet away, stood the most terrifying creature I'd ever laid eyes on. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, and built like a linebacker. But this was no man. Its entire body was covered in thick, matted brown fur. The arms hung down almost to its knees, ending in huge hands with long fingers. But it was the face that haunts me to this day. It was like some nightmarish blend of ape and man. A sloping forehead, deep-set eyes that glowed with an unnatural intelligence, a broad, flat nose, and a mouth full of yellowed teeth frozen in a snarl. For a split second, we just stared at each other, both of us frozen in shock. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't even blink. It felt like the whole world had stopped spinning. Then, as if a spell had been broken, the creature let out a bone-chilling roar that seemed to shake the very ground. Before I could even react, it wheeled around and took off into the woods, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. I stood there, trembling, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. Did that really just happen? Had I actually seen what I thought I saw? Part of me wanted to believe it was all just some vivid hallucination brought on by the heat. But I knew deep down that it was real. I'd come face to face with something that shouldn't exist, something straight out of a campfire story or an old folk tale. I'd seen Bigfoot. I don't know how long I stood there trying to process what had just happened. Eventually I managed to snap out of it enough to run back to the cabin. I burst through the door, babbling incoherently about what I'd seen. My folks were skeptical at first, of course. Who wouldn't be? But they could see how shaken up I was, how genuine my fear was. My dad grabbed his rifle and we went out to check around the outhouse. Sure enough, there were signs that something big had been there. Broken branches, trampled undergrowth, and most damning of all, a set of massive footprints pressed into the soft earth. They were easily 18 inches long and 8 inches wide, with 5 distinct toes. Nothing human could have made those tracks. We followed the prints for a ways, but they disappeared into rockier terrain where we couldn't track them anymore. By then it was getting dark, so we headed back to the cabin. None of us got much sleep that night, I can tell you that. We were all on edge, jumping at every little sound. Around midnight we heard it, a series of high-pitched, warbling screams echoing through the forest. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before or since. Not quite human, not quite animal. It raised the hair on the back of my neck and sent chills down my spine. The screams went on for what felt like hours, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. It was like the creature was patrolling the woods around our cabin, letting us know it was still out there. Needless to say, we packed up and left first thing in the morning. I begged my parents never to make me go back there, and to their credit, they never did. We sold the cabin not long after. In the years since, I've done a lot of research into Bigfoot sightings and encounters. I know now that what I saw matches up with countless other reports from all over the country. I'm not crazy, and I wasn't imagining things. What I saw that day was real. I've never told many people about what happened. Who'd believe me? But I know what I saw. That creature was flesh and blood, as real as you or me. And it's still out there somewhere, deep in the forests of Michigan. Sometimes I wonder if it remembers our encounter as vividly as I do. Does it ever think about the scared kid it stumbled across all those years ago? Or am I just one of countless humans it's crossed paths with over its long life? I may never know the answers to those questions, but one thing's for certain. I'll never forget that day as long as I live. It changed everything for me, made me realize that the world is a much stranger, much more mysterious place than we like to believe. There are things out there in the dark woods that defy explanation. Things that shouldn't exist, but do. I've seen one with my own eyes. And sometimes late at night when the wind is howling through the trees, I swear I can still hear those unearthly screams echoing in the distance. Story 23. I was just a teenager back in '62 when it happened. Me and 10 of my buddies decided to go camping up near Twin Lakes for a long weekend. We were all pretty excited. It was our first big trip without any adults tagging along. We packed up a couple cars with tents, sleeping bags, coolers full of food and drinks, and hit the road early Friday morning. The drive up was uneventful, just us goofing off and singing along to the radio. We got to the campsite mid-afternoon and spent a couple hours setting everything up. It was a nice spot, nestled in the woods not far from the lakes. We got a good fire going as the sun started to set and cooked up some hot dogs for dinner. As night fell, we were all sitting around the fire, laughing and telling stories. That's when things started to get weird. Out of nowhere, we heard this loud thud as something heavy hit the ground just outside our circle of tents. We all jumped, thinking maybe a branch had fallen from a tree. But when we shined our flashlights over, we saw a rock about the size of a melon sitting there. "What the hell?" my friend Jack said, walking over to check it out. "Where did this come from?" We were all confused, looking around trying to figure out how a rock that big could have just appeared. As Jack bent down to pick it up, another one came flying in from the darkness, landing with a heavy thud just a few feet from the fire. We all leapt to our feet, hearts pounding. "Who's out there?" I yelled, trying to sound braver than I felt. No answer. For the next hour or so, more rocks kept raining down around us. They'd come flying out of the pitch-black woods, always landing close but never actually hitting anyone. We were freaked out, huddled close to the fire and jumping at every sound. A couple of the guys wanted to pack up and leave right then, but we decided to stick it out till morning. Looking back, I'm not sure if that was brave or just plain stupid. None of us got much sleep that night. We took turns keeping watch, but never saw or heard anything moving out in the woods. The rocks stopped coming eventually, but the damage was done. We were all on edge. When the sun finally came up, we were exhausted but relieved to have made it through the night. We started packing up our gear, eager to get out of there. That's when Bill, one of the older guys in our group, came running back from the road, looking white as a sheet. "Guys, you're not going to believe what I just saw," he said out of breath. We gathered around as he told us about the creature he'd spotted crossing the road about a quarter-mile down. "It was huge," Bill said, his eyes wide, "covered in dark fur. At first it was on all fours, then it stood up on two legs as it reached the other side. I've never seen anything move like that." We peppered him with questions, but he swore up and down he wasn't making it up or seeing things. "It was real," he insisted. "Bigfoot or something, I don't know. But it was there." A few of us hiked down to where Bill had his sighting, but we didn't see any tracks or other signs. Still, the whole thing had us majorly spooked. We finished packing up in record time and got the hell out of there. On the drive home, we tried to make sense of what had happened. The rocks were real enough. We'd gathered up a few as proof. But where did they come from? And what was the thing Bill saw? We went round and round, but couldn't come up with any good explanations. For weeks after, I had trouble sleeping. Every little sound outside my window would set my heart racing. I kept thinking about those rocks flying in from the darkness, imagining what kind of creature could have thrown them. The image of that thing Bill described, dropping to all fours then rising up on two legs, was burned into my brain. I've been back to Twin Lakes a few times over the years. It's a beautiful area, and I tried to tell myself that what happened was just some messed-up prank or a bear we mistook for something else. But deep down, I know it was more than that. Something was out there in those woods that night. Something that didn't want us there. To this day, I still get chills thinking about it. That feeling of being watched from the shadows, of something huge and unknown lurking just beyond the firelight. I don't know if it was Bigfoot or what, but I know it was real. And I know I never want to experience anything like that again. I've told this story to a few people over the years, but most just laugh it off or think I'm exaggerating. Maybe I am. Maybe time has warped my memories, but I swear every detail is exactly as I remember it. Those flying rocks, Bill's sighting on the road, it all happened. Sometimes I wish I could forget about it, go back to when camping was just a fun weekend activity and not something that fills me with dread. But I can't. That weekend changed me. It opened my eyes to the fact that there are things out there we can't explain, things that defy logic and reason. I still love the outdoors, but I'm a lot more cautious now. I pay attention to my surroundings, always on alert for anything out of place, and I never, ever camp alone. Some part of me is always waiting for those rocks to start flying again, for that massive shape to come lumbering out of the tree line. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened that night in '62, but I know it was real. And I know that whatever is out there in the deep woods of Michigan, it's something beyond our comprehension. Something ancient and powerful that doesn't want to be found. So if you're ever camping up near Twin Lakes, keep your eyes open and your wits about you. And if you hear something moving in the darkness or see rocks sailing in from nowhere, don't stick around to investigate. Pack up and get out of there as fast as you can. Trust me, you don't want to meet what's lurking in those woods. Story 24. I felt a shiver of anticipation run down my spine. Grandma Emma wasn't one for tall tales or flights of fancy. If she was about to share a secret she'd kept for decades, I knew it must be something extraordinary. It was a day much like this one, she began, her voice trembling slightly. Hot and sticky, the kind of summer day where you can't escape the heat no matter what you do. My brothers and I had spent the afternoon down by Wen Lake, trying to cool off in the water. As the day started to wind down, Ma called us in for supper. The boys ran on ahead, but I lingered behind, not quite ready to leave the peaceful shoreline. Grandma paused, taking a deep breath as if steeling herself to continue. That's when I saw them. At first, I thought it was just a family of bears swimming in the distance. But as I looked closer, I realized these creatures were like nothing I'd ever seen before. She described how 5 humanoid figures emerged from the water about 50 yards from where she stood, frozen in shock. There were 3 large ones, presumably adults, and 2 smaller ones that seemed to be children. But these were no ordinary human swimmers. They were covered head to toe in dark, matted fur, Grandma said, her eyes wide as she recalled the scene. Not like a bear's fur, but longer and shaggier. And they walked upright just like people. But they were massive. The adults must have been over 7 feet tall, and they were completely naked with no clothes or coverings of any kind. I felt goosebumps rising on my arms as I tried to imagine the sight. Grandma went on to describe how the creatures moved with a strange loping gait as they emerged from the lake. Their arms were incredibly long, hanging down past their knees. Their faces were flat and ape-like, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow in the fading daylight. I wanted to run, to scream for help, she said, but I was paralyzed with fear. I could only stand there, half hidden behind a large oak tree, and watch as these beings made their way up the shoreline. The smaller creatures frolicked and played, splashing water at each other in a way that seemed almost childlike. But the adults moved with purpose, their massive heads swiveling back and forth as if scanning for danger. Grandma said she had the distinct impression they were intelligent, not just animals, but something more. Suddenly, one of the adults turned and looked right at me, she whispered. Those eyes, I'll never forget them as long as I live. They weren't animal eyes, but they weren't human either. There was an awareness there, a depth of intelligence that chilled me to my core. For a heart-stopping moment, Grandma Emma thought the creature was going to approach her. But then one of the smaller ones made a strange hooting sound, and the entire group lumbered off into the thick forest that bordered the lake. I don't know how long I stood there shaking like a leaf, Grandma continued. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. Finally, I managed to tear myself away and ran home as fast as my legs could carry me. When she burst into the farmhouse, out of breath and white as a sheet, her parents immediately knew something was wrong. Between gasping sobs, she managed to relay what she'd witnessed. To her surprise, her father didn't dismiss her story or accuse her of making things up. Instead, he shared a grave look with her mother before sitting young Emma down at the kitchen table. "Listen to me carefully," he said in his thick German accent. "What you saw today, it's something that must remain a secret. Do you understand?" Grandma nodded, still too shaken to speak. Her father went on to explain that they had heard whispers of strange creatures in the forests since arriving in Michigan years before. The native people had legends stretching back centuries about massive hair-covered beings that walked like men. But if we speak of such things, her father warned, people will think we are crazy. They will laugh at us, call us superstitious immigrants who believe in fairy tales. It could ruin our standing in the community, make it impossible for us to do business or be taken seriously. So, young Emma was sworn to secrecy, instructed never to breathe a word of what she'd seen to anyone outside the immediate family. It was a burden she carried for decades, always wondering if she'd truly witnessed something extraordinary, or if her young mind had somehow conjured up an elaborate fantasy. "But I know what I saw," Grandma Emma told me, her voice filled with conviction. "Those creatures were real as you and me sitting here now. And sometimes late at night when the wind is blowing through the trees, I swear I can still hear their strange calls echoing across the lake." I sat in stunned silence as she finished her tale, my mind reeling with the implications. Could there really be some unknown species of primate living in the forests of Michigan? How had they managed to remain hidden for so long? "Why are you telling me this now?" I finally managed to ask. Grandma Emma reached out and took my hand, her papery skin cool against my own. "Because someone needs to know the truth," she said softly. "I'm an old woman now, and I won't be around forever. I don't want this secret to die with me. And maybe the world is finally ready to hear it." In the years since that conversation, I've done extensive research into similar sightings and encounters across North America. I've read about Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and other legendary humanoid creatures. And while I've never seen anything like what my grandmother described that day in 1910, I can't help but wonder what other secrets might be hiding in the forests and wild places of our world. Sometimes, when I visit the old family property in Livingston County, I find myself drawn to the shores of Wen Lake. I stand there as the sun sets, scanning the tree line and still waters, half hoping and half dreading that I might catch a glimpse of something extraordinary. So far, the only creatures I've seen are the usual woodland animals, deer, raccoons, the occasional fox. But every now and then, when the light is just right and the forest is unusually still, I feel a prickle on the back of my neck. It's as if unseen eyes are watching from the shadowy depths of the trees. In those moments, I can almost believe that my grandmother's incredible story was true, that somewhere out there, these mysterious beings still roam the wilderness, always just beyond the reach of our understanding. I don't know if I'll ever have answers to the questions that have haunted me since that summer evening on the porch. But I do know this. My grandmother's experience opened my eyes to the possibility that our world is far stranger and more wondrous than we can imagine. And for that, I'll always be grateful. Story 25. We had been driving for about an hour when I decided to pull over at a scenic overlook. The view was breathtaking. Miles of dense forest stretching out before us, with snow-capped peaks in the distance. I figured it would be a good spot for the boys to run around and burn off some energy before we headed back. As soon as I put the car in park, they bolted out the doors, racing each other to the guardrail at the edge of the cliff. I chuckled as I watched them, remembering what it was like to be that young and carefree. I got out and stretched my legs, breathing in the fresh mountain air. It was so peaceful up there. Nothing but the sound of the wind in the trees and the occasional bird call. I walked over to join the boys at the railing, pointing out different landmarks in the valley below. After about 15 minutes, I decided it was time to get going. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, and I wanted to get back down the mountain before dark. "All right, boys, time to head out," I called. They groaned in protest, but trudged back to the car. As I was unlocking the doors, I heard a strange rustling sound coming from the trees behind us. I turned to look, but didn't see anything out of the ordinary. We all piled back into the car, and I turned the key in the ignition. But instead of the engine roaring to life, all I heard was a sputtering noise. I tried again, but no luck. "Come on, don't do this to me now," I muttered under my breath. The boys in the back were getting antsy. "What's wrong, Uncle Jerry?" Tommy asked. "Nothing to worry about," I assured him. "Just a little car trouble. I'm sure I can get it started." I popped the hood and got out to take a look, though I didn't know much about cars beyond the basics. As I was peering at the engine, trying to spot anything obviously wrong, I heard that rustling sound again, louder this time and closer. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I slowly turned around, and that's when I saw it. Emerging from the tree line about 50 feet away was the biggest, most terrifying creature I'd ever laid eyes on. It was at least 8 feet tall, covered in thick, matted brown fur. Its arms hung down almost to its knees, ending in massive hands with long, sharp claws. But it was the face that still haunts my nightmares to this day. Jet black eyes that seemed to bore right through me, a broad, flat nose, and a mouth full of yellowed fangs. I stood there frozen in shock for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Then my survival instincts kicked in, and I sprinted back to the driver's side door. As I reached for the handle, I heard the boys inside start screaming. They had spotted the monster too. I yanked the door open and dove inside, slamming it shut behind me. "Uncle Jerry, what is that thing?" Tommy wailed. Billy was sobbing uncontrollably in the back seat. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the ignition. It's okay, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're going to be fine. The car's going to start and we're going to drive away." But the engine just sputtered weakly when I turned the key. I looked up and my blood ran cold. The creature was lumbering towards us, picking up speed. It let out a bone-chilling roar that seemed to shake the whole car. The boys' screams reached a fever pitch. I kept trying the ignition over and over, praying for a miracle. Just as the beast reached the front of the car, the engine finally roared to life. I slammed it into reverse and stomped on the gas. We shot backwards, the tires squealing. But before I could shift into drive, a massive hairy arm smashed through the driver's side window. I felt white-hot pain explode across my face as razor-sharp claws raked down my cheek. Somehow, operating on pure adrenaline and terror, I managed to throw the car into drive and floor it. We lurched forward, the monster's arm pulling free as we accelerated. I didn't even glance in the rearview mirror, too focused on getting us the hell out of there as fast as possible. The boys were still crying in the back seat, but I barely registered it. All I could think about was putting as much distance between us and that thing as I could. We tore down the mountain at breakneck speed, taking the hairpin turns way too fast. It's a miracle we didn't go careening off the edge. My face was on fire, blood dripping down onto my shirt. But the pain was secondary to the all-consuming fear that still gripped me. It wasn't until we reached the bottom and merged onto the highway that I finally started to relax slightly. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw no sign of pursuit. The boys had quieted down to sniffles and whimpers. "Are you two okay back there?" I asked, my voice shaky. They both nodded silently. I drove straight to the nearest hospital. The boys were physically unharmed, just badly shaken up. I needed 37 stitches to close the gashes on my face. When the doctor asked what happened, I lied and said I'd been attacked by a bear. I knew the truth would sound crazy. To this day, I don't know what that creature was. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, some unknown species. I have no explanation. All I know is that it was terrifyingly real, and I'm lucky to have escaped with my life. The incident left more than just physical scars. For months afterwards, I had horrible nightmares. I couldn't sleep without the lights on. Any unexpected noise would send me into a panic. I never told anyone the full story of what happened, not even my wife. I was too afraid people would think I was crazy. Tommy and Billy were sworn to secrecy too. As far as I know, they've kept that promise all these years. But the memory of that day has weighed on me for decades. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all. But then I look in the mirror and see the faded scars on my face, and I know it was real. I'm an old man now, and I don't have many years left. I guess that's why I'm finally sharing this story. I need someone else to know the truth before I'm gone. That creature is out there somewhere. I only pray no one else ever has to experience the terror we did on that mountain. If you're ever in those woods, be careful. And if you hear rustling in the trees, don't stick around to see what it is. Run. Run as fast as you can, and don't look back.